Morning. Welcome to today's hearing of the Yoorrook Justice Commission. Today we continue our inquiry into the historic and ongoing social injustice for Victorian First Peoples, hearing Block 7. Before we continue, I would ask Commissioner Hunter to give a welcome to country.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to welcome you to my lands, the lands of the Wurundjeri, pay respects to the elders and ancestors, past and present. Acknowledge that today's hearing may be difficult for some and that feel free to reach out, and there's 1300 yarn, but it's not easy topic. Also, with the passing down of the coroner's findings last night, I just want to honour those that have gone before us at the hands of violence. And today's discussions will be difficult, started already. But know that Bunjil watches over us, and we honour those that have come before us. But just to reiterate that every number we talk about and every statistic we talk about today is a person, not just particularly an Aboriginal woman or child. So I just want to reiterate that. And may Bunjil watch over us today as we conduct Aboriginal business. Wamjeka. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Could we have appearances, please, Council?
Thank you, Chair. This morning I appear with Ms Fitzgerald to assist you. I thank Commissioner Hunter for your welcome to country and acknowledge that we're on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people. I offer respects to elders and ancestors of the legal team and offer my respect to all First Nations peoples who are following this hearing and offering their wisdom as we deal with this difficult issues. I especially want to thank those who work in the family violence space, who offer support, shelter and safety to all those affected.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. I appear today with Ms Caffarella for the two witnesses who will be giving evidence today. We have the Minister for Prevention of Family Violence, Vicki Ward, and we also have the Deputy Secretary of Family Safety Victoria, Dr Melanie Heenan. Thank you, Commissioner Hunter, for your welcome. We acknowledge that today's hearing is held on the land of the Wurundjeri people, your people. We pay respect to elders present and past. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. We would also like to acknowledge other Aboriginal elders. We acknowledge any First Peoples here today, whether it's in person or watching online. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chair, as has been noted, we welcome this morning the Minister for Family Violence and the Deputy Secretary for Family Safety Victoria. So welcome Minister Ward and Dr Heenan. I might start with you, Minister. Could you state your full name for the record, please?
Vicki Yvonne Ward.
You undertake to give truthful evidence to this commission?
I do.
Dr Heenan, could you state your full name, please?
Melanie Jane Heenan.
You also undertake to give truthful evidence to this hearing. For the Commissioner's reference, Minister Ward's witness statement dated the 27th of March 2024 appears at DFFH.0024.001.0054, and Dr Heenan's statement dated 27 March 2024 appears at DFFH.0024.001.0001. So we might just deal with the mechanics first, if I may. Starting with you, Minister Ward, you've prepared a witness statement for use in this commission, and that statement is dated the 27th of March 2024.
Yes.
And is that statement true and correct?
Yes.
Dr Heenan, now turning to you, you've also prepared a witness statement for the commission, for the purpose of the commission, with a number of attachments, and that witness statement is dated the 27th of March 2024.
Yes.
And is that statement true and correct? I do tender those witness statements, Commissioners, and there is a tender list that I tender at this stage so that those materials can be uploaded to the website now. I do note that the State Council haven't had a final opportunity to review that list, but if there's any issues, we'll work those out through the day.
Thank you, Councillor.
So, Dr. Ward, can I start with you? Sorry, Minister Ward. Would you like to make an opening statement?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting myself and Dr. Heenan to be here this morning. I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're on today and where my family and I live, the beautiful country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I thank you, Commissioner Hunter and Godgen, for your welcome to country. I pay respect to all elders, past and present, and I pay my respect to all First Peoples today or watching online. I acknowledge the ancestors of all First Peoples and their cultural connection to land, waterway, sea and air, which stretches back more than 60,000 years. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I value the opportunity to live, work and connect to community on the lands of the Wurundjeri and across all traditional lands in this state. I have deep gratitude for living where I do. I recognise my fortune and that this fortune rests on the back of colonisation and the harm it has caused to First Nations people. I acknowledge that colonisation has caused injustice to First Peoples, which began with the sealers who peppered these shores nearly 200 years ago. I recognise the social, economic and political injustice colonisation caused and the intergenerational hurt of colonisation that we see today. I also acknowledge that historically, the systems that have been designed to keep women safe from family violence have been marked by discrimination and systemic racism. They have failed to listen to First Peoples women and have failed to keep First women and children safe. They have also too often led to the removal of children and perpetuated the intergenerational trauma that child removal can create. I apologise to First Peoples victim survivors, families, community and those directly affected by family violence. I know that this morning's hearing may be challenging for people here with us, as well as those who are watching online. Family violence has such a wide reach. It is in every community. There are so many scars, some are deep and some run just below the surface. And I acknowledge the high number of First Peoples women who have violence used against them. And it also needs to be understood that much of this violence is at the hands of men who are not First Nations people. I thank the First Peoples I have met since I became the Minister for Prevention of Family Violence 8 months ago for sharing their stories, insights and knowledge with me. I thank them for this trust and generosity. I thank the Victim Survivor Advisory Council, particularly our 2 First Nations members. I thank everyone who works in this sector, particularly First People who work deeply and hard to restore First People and their sense of self-respect and connection to culture. I thank everybody who participates in the Delta Forum. Finally, I thank the Commissioners for the opportunity for the State to learn further through the Commission's ongoing work and recommendations. I acknowledge the enormous body of work that has been undertaken. The truth and knowledge that has been shared in this room and elsewhere is important and it is precious. I am grateful and humbled to sit here today as the Minister for Prevention of Family Violence and indeed as myself, to be included in this important truth-telling process into injustices against First Peoples in Victoria. Thank you for allowing me to make this statement and I welcome your questions, which I will answer with purpose and with truth. And I know Dr. Heenan would like to acknowledge country. Thank you.
Please, Dr. Heenan.
I would like to thank Commissioner Hunter for her welcome this morning also. It is with the utmost respect that I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this important truth-telling work is being undertaken, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my deep respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal elders of other communities and other First Peoples who are here today, and also those that are viewing the live stream. I also want to acknowledge First Peoples colleagues with whom I have the pleasure of working each day. I acknowledge that the sovereignty of the lands on which we meet has never been ceded and that this always was and always will be First Peoples land.
Thank you both. Minister, can I start with you? You currently hold the offices of Minister for Prevention of Family Violence and also the Minister for Employment.
Correct.
You were appointed to the Minister for Prevention of Family Violence in 2023.
2020. Yes, October 2023.
So a relatively short time in that role. Prior to that time, you've held various other parliamentary positions, including as a member of various committees, and you were Parliamentary Secretary for Employment and Industry, for Transport Infrastructure and Public Transport, and for Education.
Yes,
So this is your first ministerial portfolio.
yes.
And can I ask you in a broad sense, since your immersion in this topic since October last year, do you feel that you have a sufficient grounding in the ministerial portfolios to give an overview of what's happening in the space to the Commission today?
I think it's impossible to have or not impossible, I think it's very difficult to have a deep embedded knowledge of this portfolio because it's very complex. But I have worked very hard in the 8 months that I've had this portfolio to understand it and have as deep and a broader knowledge of it as I can.
Would you describe to the commissioners the sort of consultations you've undertaken, the sort of inquiries you've asked your staff to pursue to give you that grounding in the topics that we're talking about today?
When I commenced the portfolio, we had a series of briefings with the department who would every other week give me a bit of a deep dive. And I'm sorry, I hate using jargon, but I don't know what else to call it. Give me a bit of a deeper overview in terms of the things that have been going on, the things that have brought us up to the point of me taking on the portfolio. We've also looked at reports. We've looked at the materials that have been circulated. I've gone out as much as possible into community to talk with people, whether it's at Orange Doors, whether it's people who are delivering services, I learn by reading, but I also learn by experience and by talking to other people. So I found the most invaluable way of understanding my portfolio has been the ongoing conversations that I've had since I've had the portfolio.
Have you, pardon me, have you had the opportunity yet to speak directly to senior police about their training methods?
We've had with the Attorney General, I've had 2 meetings with Victoria Police to just talk in broad terms around the challenges that we see with the family violence or with family violence generally. And the Attorney General and I have sought to go out to the Glen Waverley Police Academy to have a look at their training and to have a look at how they are learning. New cadets are learning about family violence. So it's embedded, from what I understand, it's embedded within the 9-month course that they do. And there's a simulation that is a part of the unit that they do on family violence, where they have actors who role play and help them kind of understand a bit of a real-time, real-life experience. But I do want to have an understanding of what that looks like, how embedded that learning is across their 9 months, rather than being a snapshot. Like, I don't know if it's a snapshot. I don't know how deep it goes, and I really want to see it. So we've been waiting for the time in the academy cycle for that moment to be available to us, which I think is in a few weeks.
And it might be an obvious question, but why is it important to understand police training and their methods in responding to family violence?
Because they play such an important role in response, in terms of the immediate response when somebody is calling them or somebody has called them to respond to a family violence incident. It's important because we know that historically there have been, and even today, there are challenges with the way that police can respond to a family violence incident. And that's whether it's misidentification, that's whether it is responding to understanding the severity of what is going on, understanding people's human reactions within a traumatic situation. So it's a very complex, it's a very complex situation that you can find yourself in, and being able to make very quick judgments in a very informed way is very important. And when we have last year, over 94,000 incidents of family violence recorded in our state, and where we've got over 57,000 people using violence in our state in a year. We know that this is core business for Victoria Police. This is something that Victoria Police are called out to regularly. And the national statistic is that every 6 minutes there's a call regarding a family violence incident. So they are embedded, if you like, in family violence in the sense that they are being called every 6 minutes to respond to an incident.
Just to clarify, is it always police, or are there sometimes health professionals like ambulance officers attending family violence call outs?
Yeah, it can sometimes be ambulance. I think it depends on the call centre and how the call centre manage it. But I think for the vast majority of time, if not always, police do have a presence. Police and Dr. Heenan will probably have greater depth of knowledge on this, but police need to come to these incidents because you need to start that L17, that reporting process, so that systems can start to begin to respond to this more broadly.
We'll come to the L17, but that's the primary tool used by police responding to a request for attendance
Yep.
in response to family violence, a tool they use to measure risk.
It's a tool that they measure to, and please correct me if I'm going down the wrong path here. It's a measure that they use to record and to understand what has happened in that moment. So it's a snapshot. Would that be how you would describe it? It's a bit of a snapshot of an incident at that particular time and moment that then becomes a part of a broader process of understanding risk. And it's really at the multi-agency risk assessment management framework, those tools that Victoria Police have been trained in using, as well as other agencies like Orange Door. That's when you really get more of a deeper understanding, or you start to really work through the risk.
So the L17 and the multi-agency response tool, which is known as MARAM, they are the primary tools that determine whether a response to a request for attendance in response to family violence goes down a criminal justice path or another pathway.
No, I
Okay?
think I would think that they're quite separate in the sense that a MARAM is more of the social response and the therapeutic response and the intervention response and the risk assessment response. Whereas I think, I don't even know if an L17, you might know this more, has got a role to play in terms of pursuing justice outcomes.
So yeah, I can definitely add to that. I guess for L17s, the police are doing a level of risk assessment. It's not precisely a MARAM insofar as a MARAM might be undertaken by a practitioner, or might be undertaken by somebody at an Orange Door, for example. But it certainly is a mechanism through which risk can be assessed at attendance, on attendance. But as to whether it goes down a criminal justice pathway, it wouldn't generally be at that point that's being assessed. It would be trying to make a decision about who the predominant aggressor is, who the affected family member is, and making sure that there's appropriate referrals, and possibly there might be discussion about an intervention order, which might take the applicant into the court, or magistrates court, I should say, or it might be that the police decide that they are going to initiate an intervention order or an application for an intervention order, but it probably wouldn't happen at that very, very early stage.
Okay, so principally a tool for capturing information, which might be self-reporting by those that are present when police attend, but can be used in some way in the MARAM risk assessment process.
Yes, I'd say an L17 is also the principal tool for referral as well. So once those assessments are made, then the Victoria Police's role will be to make sure that the affected family member is getting access to the referrals into supports that they might need. And there might also be some action taken in relation to the person using violence, but the focus would very much be on the safety and risk at that stage for the victim survivor.
I skipped over the, sorry, Commissioner.
Sorry, can I just ask, with the L17, you're talking about referrals, would I be correct in saying when that happens, it automatically would go to a referral process, or would it be up? What is that process?
It would generally go to the Orange Door. So as the now the statewide entry pathway for family violence, so it would generally be a referral to the Orange Door. It could be that there is, if it's after hours, so on a weekend, for example, it could be that the L17 goes through to Safe Steps, which is the 24/7 crisis response service. So it's possible that there would be some interaction between L17s and that 24/7 crisis response service, but thereafter it would generally be referrals to the Orange Door to do that initial screening and intake and assessment in relation to
that's automatic that it goes through.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you could see it like a trigger point, so that wherever a service is available, whether it's Safe Steps or Orange Door, the L17 is a trigger to then reach out to the victim survivor, as well as to the person who has used violence.
Thank you.
Dr. Heenan, I skipped this and I didn't want to. You yourself have spent more than 30 years immersed in this space of family violence and related topics, correct?
Correct.
And you commenced the role as Deputy Secretary in September of last year. Nevertheless, your work has involved, as you set out in your witness statement, a number of important posts and positions, including Victorian Law Reform Commission, the Australian Centre for Study of Sexual Assault, the Manager of Respect and Responsibility, the Manager of Preventing Violence Against Women, the Executive Director of the Court Network, who provides services to those attending court, and Victim Services, Executive Director of Victim Services Support and Reform for the Department of Justice and Community Safety, correct? And so you are well placed within the department to lead the government's response to family violence, I suggest.
Yes, I would agree with that, and in my current role to oversight the current system that supports responses to family violence and its prevention.
But just in terms of the timing, were you working within government at the time of the Royal Commission?
I was not.
Has part of your duties been to review the recommendations of the Royal Commission and to assess the efficacy of the government's response to that Royal Commission?
It has, to the extent that being in this role for the past 9 months. So yes, in terms of understanding the implementation of those recommendations, perhaps not recommendation by recommendation, but I would have a good sense of the progress with the implementation of those 227 recommendations. I would also add, Ms. McLeod, that I was a witness at the Royal Commission when I was in the role of CEO of Court Network. So I guess I had a very good sense of the Royal Commission's work.
I don't mean to spring this on you, but would you have any issue with us checking obtaining your evidence to the Royal Commission and using that evidence in this commission as well?
I would not.
Sorry to spring that on you. Can you say in a general sense, looking at the Royal Commission and where we've come so far, can you offer us your impression of the success of the work to date? We've heard recent critiques in the media of the work and where it's been failing. The Commission has heard evidence about gaps and the unacceptable numbers of incidents of family violence against First Nations women. And the Minister just referred to 57,000 people using family violence in the state. So how successful has it been in a broad sense from your perspective, and where are the gaps?
Thanks, Ms. McLeod. I would certainly want to start by acknowledging the evidence that has been given and the submissions that I have read, and recognise that there are still significant limitations and gaps in the system. That said, I would say there has been an incredible change on the back of the reforms that were recommended by the Royal Commission. It was, I think, the first time in Victoria that we had the level of whole of Victorian government focus, obviously, on something as important as family violence. I think it came in the context of a watershed moment in many ways, with the death of Luke Batty, but also I think with just what was becoming just this recognition across the community of the prevalence of family violence. So in terms of the Royal Commission's work being able to centre a community understanding of family violence, I think that was I think that's held. I think there's been a certain benchmark almost that's been achieved across community in understanding family violence is a critical issue, critical community issue and a social justice issue. But in terms of what it's meant for the system, the fact that we have some of the, I think some people refer to it as game changing. I'm not sure that I'm aligned with that language, but something to that effect. When we look at the fact that we've now got orange doors across the state, which was really a flagship recommendation from the Royal Commission to do things differently in relation to providing victim survivors, including children and young people and families where there were wellbeing concerns, that entry point into a system, into a non-statutory system, where their risk and safety and needs could be assessed across the state through those orange door networks. So that was probably the panacea, I guess, of the recommendations, having that kind of infrastructure, brand new service system infrastructure. I think a couple of the other real standouts coming into this position that have been incredibly innovative have been things like MARAM. I think MARAM is a mechanism that's now recognised and provided a shared language for assessing risk and managing risk across, what is now, I think, up to 6,000 different organisations who are prescribed to align their policies and procedures with MARAM. And that's not solely in the context of specialist family violence services, but across mental health and justice and education. So I think MARAM has been one of those drivers of change and common understanding in risk and risk management being incredibly important for us all to understand and be able to act on. Information sharing has been part of that as well, sharing information where we wouldn't have done that before in the same ways, legislation that's helped us to drive that. Perhaps the final thing as a call out would be the Central Information Point, the SIP, which is a system that allows the Orange Door, for example, risk assessment and management panels, otherwise known as RAMPs, and the 2 statewide peaks through Safe Steps and Note of Violence, or Mental Health Service, I should say, to be able to get additional risk-related information about people who use violence. So that's where we've got platforms that are now talking to each other across Magistrates Court Victoria, corrections, child protection, and services themselves in being able to, I'm forgetting, Victoria Police, importantly. So those 4 very different platforms of data and of collecting information about risk, being able to compile a single report about a person who's using violence's risk and be able to relay that back to a practitioner. What we know from practitioners is that something like 78%, I think, of them will adjust their risk rating having had access to the SIP report. So that was an incredibly important change for the system.
And when was that change implemented?
Well, SIP was a SIP-like function was a recommendation of the Royal Commission. I think it was established in, look, I would be guessing, I know it's either 2019 or 2020.
I think so. So the family violence, the Royal Commission reported in 2016. This was a step that was taken 2 or 3 years later, perhaps.
It was, Ms. McLeod, but it was a very, very complex system to build. So the infrastructure and I mean technologically, the infrastructure was complex, and it's years ago. Like in the world of technology, it's years ago now in that sense. So it was a very tricky undertaking when you think about those 4 areas: Vic Pol, corrections. They will always have a reticence about sharing data or having platforms that can speak to each other, not because they don't think that might be helpful, but because of the risk, I guess, of exposure or systems not being tightly enough contained and regulated. So to have all of that work done, the consultation work done, the assurances done, all of the legislative change, I think there was legislative change around it as well, to enable that platform to be built. It does offer a bit of a blueprint, and I know the Minister's been talking about it at the Commonwealth level too, just about the absolute opportunity that SIP-like functions can offer the rest of the country.
Can I ask that, Dr. Heenan, you talked about MARAM. Can you, just for the benefit of commissioners, can you just explain a little bit more about what MARAM is?
Yes, absolutely, Commissioner. So MARAM is the multi-agency risk assessment and management tool, or program of work, I should say. The design of it was building on some work that had been done a number of years ago, actually. We'd be going well back, more than 10 years ago now, to what was referred to as the Common Risk Assessment Framework, or CRAF. That was the first time in this state, at least, that particularly specialist family violence workers, but not solely, police as well, were starting to talk about sharing information and sharing our understanding of risk. And talking together about whether or not you could form a view about levels of risk. It was particularly focused on lethal violence. So the idea of CRAF and certainly the idea with MARAM is fundamentally about trying to get ahead of victim survivors being killed. And so MARAM has become a huge body of work. It's got a number of different facets to it, I guess, in terms of foundational skills. It's got guidance for all different types of workforces, I guess, those that are working squarely in the family violence space, those who may come across family violence in the work that they're doing, perhaps not squarely in family violence, but where family violence issues might present. And even for universal services, there's guidance in relation to identifying family violence and being able to perhaps not assess and manage risk, but be alert to risk and possibly information share if they need to.
Can you just outline for me just briefly, because we'll probably come back to this. I know we will certainly when we talk about cultural safety and Orange Door.
Yes.
But what are the specific parts of MARAM that address the very unique and very real higher threat of violence to First Peoples women?
Yes. Thank you for that question. I think some of the foundational guidelines or foundational knowledge that was developed had the great benefit of input from specialist family violence ACOs who were able to talk about what should be in that foundational knowledge for the workforce to learn about.
Is it there?
It is. To be absolutely transparent with you, though, that there's been improvements on that front over time. So with MARAM's foundational skills, there's even written into MARAM is that it must be continuously improved. It's been just through a 5-year evidence review recently, the whole program, including the foundational guidance. And there are some very helpful recommendations in that context that we still haven't been able to adequately or accurately represent lateral violence and some other concepts that Aboriginal and community controlled organisations are saying are not the right language yet. They're wanting to test with practitioners' language over time that will be far more helpful, and we've certainly had really strong partnerships with particular ACOs over the life of the MARAM. I can keep going because it's such a.
I just got one final, just small thing, and we probably will get back to it. We've heard that, of course, Aboriginal women are far more likely to be misidentified as perpetrators rather than victims. How does MARAM address that risk and actually undo some of the incredibly harmful practice?
Yes, it has some very specific guidance that it's been developing to ensure that there is far greater opportunity to be alert to where a victim survivor may have been misidentified as the user of violence. And that's come with particular support from specialist family violence workers in the Aboriginal specialist family violence workers in the men's perpetrator or people using violence space. They've been able to, there's a particular provider who has kind of tracked the course of the development of that guidance with us and enabled us to be together testing some of the concepts with practitioners, literally being able to use some of that work with people that they're working with. So we're very alert to this problem and that it is a systemic one. And the tool is one tool, but it is an important tool because it's often used early on in the process. So Orange Door staff, for example, are getting very special training, all of the Orange Door staff, in relation to using that guidance, so that very soon into their opportunity to speak to the client, if it's an Aboriginal client or First Peoples client, they will start to use that tool, knowing that it's possible if that person has been identified as a respondent, that they may well be the victim survivor.
That being said, there are Aboriginal practice leads and Aboriginal response teams that are in Orange Doors as well. So it is more than likely that a first person presenting to the Orange Door would be seen by an Aboriginal response team who would also have that cultural lens of well and truly understanding that misidentification could be a possibility here.
Can I just go back a step to explore something you said about the understanding about the prevalence of family violence and the connection to the death of Luke Batty. In both your statements, you point to the impact of our colonial history and dispossession of First Peoples, and you both make the point that there is an understanding of the devastating impact, including of family violence on First Peoples in this state. You both acknowledge the disproportionate impact of family violence on First Peoples in this state, particularly women, and the consequences for First Peoples women in many areas of their lives. So how can it be that government only woke up to this issue of prevalence after the death of Luke Batty? These things have been known for decades, surely.
They have been known for women. Women have known about this for a very long time. And it has taken that really amplified conversation that we had. And it does feel that in many ways it was through the good luck of having a woman who was able to articulate her experience in a way that was captured by media that brought the community into a wider conversation. We have had a cultural reluctance in terms of broader Australian culture, worldwide culture, in terms of acknowledging and addressing and wanting to respond to the prevalence of male violence in communities and in homes. We have been in a social structure in our country since colonisation that has relied on a patriarchal overview, that has invested in male power and control, and that has been reluctant to really address or understand, recognise and accept that unequal distribution of power, and that the way that it can manifest itself in aggression and violence is not acceptable.
Is it your view, Minister, that that patriarchal overview infects the criminal justice response to family violence?
I think it has, since courts began in our country. How deeply it continues to pervade into courts is a difficult question for me to answer with limited experience of the courts. But I think that there are regularly challenges with people in positions of power and privilege, and often within our state and our country, the main people in those positions of power and privilege and decision-making are men. And I imagine that within our courts, there probably are men who are really struggling to get their head around inequality, how that feeds into various behaviours, how that challenges their own thinking, their own biases, whether they're conscious or unconscious. And I think that unconscious biases are probably some of the more difficult biases to work with, because you've got to have a recognition by that person that they do actually have that bias.
Is there a view, do you think, that the lives of Aboriginal women don't matter prior to this advocacy that you're talking about, so 2015?
I don't know what's worse, is whether it's the sense that they don't matter or that they're not thought about. I don't know which is the most disrespectful and which is the most hurtful.
Is there a sense that the solutions are beyond the state?
No, I don't think so at all. I certainly don't feel that. I don't feel that.
I mean, prior to advocacy by Rosie Batty.
I just don't think that there was a willingness to recognise and accept the severity of the problem. When we've all grown up in cultures or in a community where a blue singlet could be referred to as a wife basher shirt, and nobody calls that out, where it's not seen as the working class slur that it is, or where it's not seen as ingraining acceptable violent behaviour in homes, that it's a joke. I don't understand why that's funny. And it is referred to still sometimes now, but nowhere near as much as what it was when I was growing up. So that's just a really small cultural example of the pervasiveness and acceptance of violence and of violence in homes, of male violence, that, you know, for so long, violence has been accepted as a part of being male, which is incredibly unhealthy and incredibly unhelpful.
Unhealthy to both boys and girls.
Correct.
Minister, would you agree with colonisation was very violent, particularly on women and their bodies?
Absolutely.
That has silenced Aboriginal women.
Yep. Absolutely.
And-
You think of the first convict ships that came into Sydney Cove and how women's bodies was essentially currency. And you think about how that then ripples into first women and the invisibility of colonial women that is then completely compounded with the absolute invisibility of First Nations women. When colonial women are not recognised as people themselves and having custody of self,
Well, I'd also
you've got that intersection with racism, which compounds it
challenge
even further.
some of the colonial settler women business because they were seen as the brave white settlers and our women were forgotten.
Mm.
So I think our silencing in the colonial construct of an Aboriginal woman and what that represents, I think it's still alive and well today. Would you agree with that?
I would.
So how do we infiltrate these systems that then make it worse, silence? Our women can't come forward because their children will be removed, or they can't go to the police because the policemen at the table saying, no, well, we don't believe you. Like, you understand, obviously, these issues. How do we change a system, another system, because we've sat here and heard about system after system after system.
Yeah.
And including the courts you just spoke about, policing, we just heard about health systems. They all play a part in family violence. This is nothing new of violence against women, particularly Black women.
Mm-hmm.
So what are we doing?
We keep pushing, and we push at every level, whether it is the small programs that get operated through the action groups that we have across Victoria, whether it is the work in cultural awareness that we do in our institutions, whether it is continuing to refer to those plans and programs that we make to hold ourselves accountable and to manage what we do. And we keep talking about it. And I know that talking is frustrating, and I know that you can feel that sometimes we talk and talk and talk, but the more that there is a wider community conversation, the more the community is brought into this conversation, the more community broadly understands their role as advocates to end this violence, then we will start to see change. Because government has a role, our local government has a role, but community has the most important role. Community's awareness of this problem, acceptance of this problem, and willingness to change it, to address it. That's how we really get change. And this is what we're trying to trigger as a government, is continuing to work on building that societal change and building that community desire to see change and to want change and to be a part of that change.
When a woman dies at the hands of family violence, what is the process like? What is that process to understand what's happened for that woman or child that they died? Like, what is the process? I don't know. So are there recommendations? Obviously, there's coroner's reports, there's this, that. What happens to those recommendations? Because that, for me, is more words on paper and more talking.
Yeah, I'll start, and I'll refer on to Dr. Heenan in a sec, but I'll start with a conversation I had with the family violence worker at Orange Door, who said to me that whenever there is a story that they read of somebody who has been murdered, femicide, through family violence, they go to work and they're looking through their files to see whether that was one of theirs, to see what their interactions were, because it sits with them. Like they carry this too. They're looking to see, what could I have done? What could I have seen? What did I not understand? And then it becomes the broader story of what the coroner does and the recommendations that come from the coroner. But I know that in the sector themselves, they look at this very seriously and they do try and work out what was the gap.
But that's partly what the coroner does. And we have woman after woman or child after child die, and these recommendations after recommendations in the Family Violence Royal Commission. When do we stop and say we need to implement these? It shouldn't be a money issue, because lives shouldn't depend on whether we get funded for them.
I think they do get acted on.
The recommendations from the coronial inquest do, but Commissioner, I understand the frustration because it's often about that very particular case or set of circumstances rather than necessarily always connecting what the systems gaps and issues might have been. But certainly, as the Minister says, those engaged in the frontline work go through quite.
I applaud them and I understand the load they carry, particularly when someone does pass.
Yes.
You would go back and you would be making sure you would be doing all that. I guess for me, like, is there accountability for all these deaths of women and children? Like, I just feel like we just keep sitting at the table talking about frameworks and policies and recommendations, and they're still dying. And our women are so overrepresented that it's scary. And we've had on the stand, some witnesses that said, for Aboriginal community, this is crisis point. So we can talk about, look, it's nothing new. Sorry, Trav.
It's not.
I think it's important. I mean, with respects to your earlier comments, you spoke at length about the system and the implementation around what's been happening, but I didn't get a sense, and I'm no expert, I have to say, about what's happening for our people. It's a very generic response. We're here as a commission inquiring into the ongoing injustices of our people. So I just want to really make sure that we're talking to our people and our voices are loud and clear in this, because I want to ask a couple of questions here, and I won't hold up too long, but this is for the Minister first. How important are Aboriginal women's lives, Minister?
They're very important.
Anything
Absolutely.
else?
Well, they're absolutely important, and they need to be in view, and they need to be kept alive.
And how important are our children and young people's lives, Minister?
They are also very important and also need to be held in view.
Yeah, I mean, I where I'm going with this is, and this is a little bit about towards the media as well, right?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
Minister, when our people, our women are passing away at the hands of family violence, and I want to be really clear about family violence being unacceptable. And again, I'm no expert in this space, but it's unacceptable.
Absolutely.
When Aboriginal women are killed in society at the hands of family violence, why is there silence in the media about our women? Non-Aboriginal
Yeah.
women, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful to
No,
non-Aboriginal women, but
Absolutely.
there's a platform, there's profile,
Yep.
the media's all around. You'll be called to media and give responses. The Premier, other ministers that aren't their portfolios will talk on matters.
Yep.
When our women die terribly in the hands of family violence, no media, we might get a 10-second grab read out by somebody else. Like, what hope does that give our women and children in the future coming through about how important that they are seen in society?
Commissioner, it makes me furious. It makes me so angry. It makes me so angry that the media will devote such little time to this issue more broadly, but the fact that they feel that some lives are less clickbait than others makes me really angry. And it makes me angry that they have such a reluctance to be a part of helping solve this deadly problem. And I don't mean that in a positive way when I use the word deadly, sorry. They absolutely have a social contract with community, whether it is with our First Peoples community as well as our broader community. There is a social contract to be a part of a conversation with the people in this state and in this nation. And they don't do that. They do not fulfill that. They absolutely, I can only put it down to racism, but I can also only it's so cynical to be only looking for those stories that generate income, those stories that only generate advertising. It is disgraceful because they do have a social contract. They make a lot of money out of people in this state. They have a social contract to accurately report what happens in our community, the reasons why things happen, what should be the solutions, as holding government to account as absolutely, but also holding communities to account. And to talk and expose and help us understand the extent of problems. And it is absolutely shameful that they are not a part of that conversation and that they don't rise to that and be better.
It's just 45 times more likely to have contact with family violence. Just disgusting. It's 2024. I mean, it should never appropriate. It's just unbelievable. I really worry about the messages that sends our people. You know, what hope? You know, we already had issues with the voice and the judgment on our people. But thanks.
Thank you.
Commissioners, I should acknowledge that a time through this morning's evidence, there will be some clinical discussion of data. And as the commissioners have just pointed out, we should never forget the human beings behind the data that's being discussed and the programs that are being discussed. Minister, just following on from that conversation, you would agree and embrace with these principles that government sets the tone in response to this conversation in the community?
Government is working very hard to set the tone in the community, yep.
And you have dedicated yourself to that task?
Yep.
You would agree that government can amplify the stories and the messages on this topic in the media? It has the resources.
We can certainly work to.
And that you set the authorising environment for the policy and program response.
Yep.
In terms of the disproportionate impact of family violence on first women, you would accept that that requires a greater investment in the response to protect those women and children.
It requires ongoing and strengthened investment, whether it comes to prevention, whether it comes to response to supporting people who've experienced family violence, and whether it also includes the work with people who are using violence or at risk of using violence.
And you've acknowledged in your witness statement that the barriers to First Peoples women seeking support include fear of repercussions, historical mistrust of government, discrimination, fear of contact with police.
Yeah, I think it starts with the fear of not being believed, and then what can come from that.
Dr. Heenan, you note that in your witness statement, paragraph 5. Is there any response you'd like to offer to that urgent need to address those barriers to seeking assistance?
Yes, I think those barriers remain steadfastly blockages for First Nations women to be able to talk about family violence, to be able to seek help for family violence, to be able to get the access to the supports that they rightly deserve. And I think the Royal Commission referred to it as a paralysing fear in terms of the barriers to reporting to police, for example. So critical aspects of the system that are otherwise available to connect victim survivors with the supports that they need for themselves, for their children, and for the person who might be using violence to also have to get access to the supports to help them to stop violence or to reduce their risk.
I just want to read to you, Dr. Heenan, something that you said to the Royal Commission in your witness statement. I apologise to my learned friends, we don't have this on the tender list yet, but we've obtained it since you made reference to it. This is paragraph 19 of your witness statement to the Royal Commission into Family Violence. Paragraph 19, you say, there's little doubt that with this context, which is in relation to the priorities of police and so on, the rapid rise in police reports and women appearing at court seeking intervention orders was predictable. And yet the funding allocated to drive the structural reform promised by the concept of integration was inadequate. Do you need more context to remind you what you were talking about there?
No.
Okay. Instead, the funding announced in 2006 was committed to a suite of disparate strategies designed to manage the various stakeholder interests. Use that word stakeholder, noting the comments that have been made in this commission around First Peoples not being stakeholders. You say a coherent governance structure with clear ministerial and cross-departmental accountability to guide the reforms was not maintained. The integrated systems reform was without a master plan, without a blueprint for implementation, without monitoring or review mechanisms. At the local level, there was little guidance or direction on what or how to achieve integration. Paragraph 21, without a strong authorising environment, meaning government, without a master plan and without the funds to support it, the result was a patchwork of responses that vary widely across Victoria. So just reflecting on that evidence you gave to the Commission and acknowledging that you weren't working within the department at the time, are you satisfied we now have a strong authorising environment to address the issue of family violence?
I am. I think we have a much stronger authorising environment through which to respond and prevent family violence and sexual assault. And I think Victoria, post Royal Commission, I think in particular, has now become a blueprint in some ways for other states and territories in relation to some of the reforms that have meant that integrated system response. And I acknowledge the use of the term system repeatedly, but it's that it was so incredibly lacking before the Royal Commission to really understand how to bring the pieces together from entry into the system through to proper supports for everybody who might be affected by family violence. And I think that has dramatically changed.
Dr. Heenan, can I just ask this? The centrepiece of the response, of course, was Marram, wasn't it? Isn't it?
One of the key responses, exactly.
Because it's the point at which, if our prevention has failed, we have the interaction with the event on the ground. And it's multi-agency, so everyone comes in and there's this sharing of information, so as we can wrap around the issue and move it forward into satisfactory pathways. Am I right in saying that initially there was criticism of the risk assessment process in respect of Aboriginal people, in that it was said that Marram was biased in the way it dealt with Indigenous people?
I'm not aware of that specific criticism, Commissioner North. I have or the what might be being referred to specifically, I guess, within the Marram. But it wouldn't surprise me that might be the view of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations who are specialists in family violence at that time, that how family violence, the broader definitions of family violence, the impacts of colonisation, the impacts of intergenerational trauma, the importance of staying connected to country in responses to family violence, that context was not strong enough in Marram from the.
And what were all the negative features relating to the history of Indigenous participants. So Marram is based on information to be gathered from histories, and what histories you rely on are going to determine who gets what outcomes from Marram.
I think, Commissioner North, that would have been true of the Common Risk Assessment Framework, so that very first approach to Marram, and then the early conception of Marram. I think that started to shift very, very quickly with the involvement of critical ACCO voices in ensuring that the foundational knowledge, and certainly in relation to the adults using violence, that there had to be strong partnerships.
So can you give me an example on the ground of the operation of Marram where that change happened? Like what input was changed as a result of that voice to make the operation different?
Of the specific tools and guidance. So I should certainly say, and the Minister referenced a little earlier, that MARAMs are often, or a version of MARAM is often used in the orange door, given that they are the entry point. So they use a version of the MARAM, a briefer version of the MARAM.
I just make it clear, Orange Door is not Indigenous specific, is it?
You have 2 access points that are.
And there's also Aboriginal specific workforces within the orange door, the Aboriginal response.
In
Managed by
every
the
Orange
ACOs.
Door.
Yeah,
Every orange door.
managed by an ACO.
So Aboriginal practice lead, Aboriginal practitioners, and there's an Aboriginal advisory group as well that is part of the leadership, the hub leadership groups and the operations leadership groups.
So back to MARAM and its inputs.
So the Aboriginal practice leads, as the Minister was saying a little earlier, the Aboriginal practice leads are likely to be, unless the client, the Aboriginal client, the First Peoples client, preferred to a non-Aboriginal worker, would otherwise be working with the Aboriginal practice lead or the Aboriginal practitioner in relation to having those first conversations. So MARAM is the tool. It's not the thing that the client is going to hear. The client will never know that there's a MARAM. It's the dialogue that's then created so that the practitioner can start to hear the risks and issues in relation to safety, and eventually start to formulate a safety plan with in this case the Aboriginal victim survivor. So it's likely to be an Aboriginal practitioner working with an Aboriginal survivor and working through those issues in relation to risk and what's likely to strengthen and fortify safety. And those considerations include staying connected to country and family and community, looking to see in a strengths-based way what would be those opportunities to make sure her safety planning, generally her safety planning and the safety planning that will be done with the kids as well, to ensure that they are staying connected to what are their strength, and I can't think of the word right now, but those factors that are likely to help her to stay connected to all of those aspects in her social and family life that can keep her safe.
So my experience might have been a little out of date then. When did the actual participation of Indigenous practitioners start?
In the orange door?
Well, and MARAM.
Well, certainly for the orange door, it's been from inception. So there's 17 ACOs in the orange doors, or 17 ACOs that support all of the orange doors and are literally in the orange doors as a team. Pardon me. So they make up the integrated or multidisciplinary teams.
So they are full-time people who are always at these specific orange doors.
They are employed by their by what are referred to as partner agencies, so employed by their home agency, which will be an ACO,
Okay.
but they work in the orange door.
Which is reflective of the team composition that works within orange doors. They're all independent agencies that are positioned in there.
You're saying that's one mechanism to overcome the otherwise biased information that's within the risk assessment.
And I think also, Commissioner North, the changes that have been made to that foundational knowledge on the back of hearing strong advice from ACOs, specialist ACOs, but also from practitioners. So if there's a adjustment or a change or even something much more fundamental that is not doesn't have an appropriate cultural lens or is not culturally safe, then the Aboriginal team within the orange door and possibly others will be calling that out and saying it's not working, and it's not culturally safe for clients to be asking these questions in this way. So over time, that evolution of MARAM has resulted in the review, for example, that was recently done, talking about the fact that MARAM is now has got a strong appreciation both in the foundational knowledge and the tools of aspects for both victim survivors and people who use violence of the impacts of colonisation, intergenerational trauma, and the criticality of ensuring that that in responding to risk, but in also developing safety plans, that those considerations of what is likely to fortify safety for First Nations people, for example, as victim survivors, is first and foremost assessed as part of the safety plan and forms part of the safety plan. If that makes sense.
Can I say I was very disappointed in that result and that answer, because Commissioner North asked you what had changed in Marram, a specific example, given that we know the original Marram did not appropriately include how First Peoples would interact. And I guess I'm really disappointed that still, after all this time, we are getting things like Marram, which is the foundation on how the state responds and supports women experiencing violence. And it is then still up to ACOs and Aboriginal people to come in and point out to the state, despite all the statistics that show the overwhelming overrepresentation, that Aboriginal voices and Aboriginal perspectives and women's cultural safety have not been included. Why is it always Aboriginal people's, Aboriginal organisations' jobs to come in and actually get policy that works for First Peoples? I can't, why in 2024 are we still having to come in and point out and say, but you haven't taken this into account, but you haven't taken that into account? Because none of this is new. It's well known.
Understand that frustration and apologies, Commissioner. I think the other aspect to the Orange Door context, if I may, is that the kind of cultural safety work that has been going on with the Orange Doors has itself developed over time. So I think it would be disappointing if solely at this point in the Orange Doors existence, it's only First Nations workers that would be drawing attention to a cultural lens not being applied. Because I think the Orange Door has been working as a workspace, but also in terms of a service delivery point to ensure that there is cultural safety for both the workforce and for victim survivors. I know that's an ongoing process, but it certainly has been a focus in these past perhaps 2.5 years.
But we have heard repeated evidence in this commission that First Peoples do not feel safe always at Orange Door, either as workers or as people coming in to use the service. So we are, and I know you'd said that there are 2 points, but that's 2 out of.
Yes, and
with maybe 3 more on the way. Is that the way?
to end, sorry. Oh, the
There's
Aboriginal
another
access
on the way
points.
in
Sorry,
Melanie.
yes,
Yeah.
there is a third access point on the way. There is a more elaborate response to that if it's all right, or I can wait till if we're going
Perhaps
to
we can
cultural
wait
safety,
until-
we can, yes,
Well, perhaps when we get to cultural safety.
understand the comment you've made.
So to bring you back to your evidence to the Royal Commission, Dr. Heenan, and Minister, jump in if you would like to. There's a recognition in both your statements of the barriers to First Peoples women seeking support in terms of repercussions, their mistrust of government, so on. And the Royal Commission into Family Violence heard that when Aboriginal people do access mainstream services, they can be met with a number of impediments, including actual and perceived discrimination by service providers, language and cultural barriers, lack of trust in services and organisations, and lack of awareness of and engagement with local Aboriginal communities. And in your statement to the Royal Commission, you noted at paragraph 36, at a systems level for respondents, there is a dearth of effective responders. So these are for users of family violence. The interventions that do exist, particularly in relation to men's behaviour change programs, are often unsophisticated, poorly monitored and poorly resourced. So do we now, in your view, have a master plan and adequate resourcing in place to address the issue of family violence directed towards First Peoples in this state?
I think that we have very strong pillars, and I'm not seeking to find a different way of saying do we have the master plan, but I do think we have some very, very important foundations set that are able to talk to each other, that do connect in a far more integrated way, where in the context of all of the different aspects to the system, I guess, from service responses to perpetrators or people who use violence, to victim survivors, from police and to courts, with all of the limitations that we've been talking about so far, there is still levels of integration that did not exist before the Royal Commission.
Do I take it from your answer that there's been some improvement, but not yet an adequate master plan and resourcing?
I don't think we're there yet on the master plan. I think there is still I think there is a lot more work to do in understanding how that system can be more integrated. And I also think it's not ever going to have a finish line. I think this is I guess the components of this system that we're talking about will always need careful attention and focus and commitment.
So are the services that are offered, including the services you've just mentioned, are they fit for purpose to overcome the known barriers facing First Peoples women and children?
They're clearly not effective because there are still too many First Nations women and victim survivors who are not coming forward or not coming to services. I think where there's been improvement, though, is having the number of Aboriginal community controlled organisations who are specialists in this area of delivering services in family violence, whether that's for victim survivors, for people who are using violence, and for children affected by family violence as well. I think those services have developed in both breadth, but also in terms of this incredible sophistication that the system, across the system, I mean, in that sense, now has and has to have by virtue of the likes of MARAM and other responsibilities and obligations that we have in working with this system to keep women and children safe. I think in the context of First Nations responses, and to the last point you made, I think Ms McLeod perpetrator programs, I think First Nations responders from across from victim survivors to those that are using violence have been far more innovative and effective because of the holistic nature of programs that have been developed and delivered.
Sorry to intervene, but I'm just keep hearing words about how we're doing this and how we're doing that. It's actually not sufficient for anybody, for any woman, to have a system that MARAM that wasn't made for our people, to have systems that still aren't made for our people. Women, black or white, are still dying. And we want to sit here and talk about a sophisticated system. It's not very sophisticated if at the hands of violence, women and children are still dying. And I also feel that the system that you're talking about is aiming to around the women. Where is the accountability? Where's the accountability held for the deaths of women and children at the hands of violence? Where's the accountability for that? Because it's just, I don't feel, with all due respect, that you're answering the questions that we're asking. I feel like we're getting a lot of the system, and it's better now. It might be a better system now, but people are still dying, particularly Aboriginal women. And when we do get out there and talk about it as Aboriginal women, it's dismissed. We're dismissed, and it's not good enough. It's just not. One death is one death too many. And the system does not and still does not work. Since the Royal Commission, have the rates gone up or down of family violence for First Nations women?
The recording numbers have
Yeah.
gone up. The violence has always been there. The recording is going up. So it's a
Is that because
bizarre success
is that
in
because
that.
we're recognising
Correct.
Aboriginal women in the system now rather than?
It's because we're recognising them, but it is also reflective of the fact that there is a wider conversation, that there is more awareness, and that there is more support for people coming forward with their stories and the idea that they will be believed. So after the Royal Commission and the huge community noise and conversation that was made around that, with the changes that we started to make with bringing in orange doors, we saw quite a jump over a number of years of reporting within mainstream community.
And look, with all due respect, that, you know, and the bad historian, I respect that totally.
Yeah.
But without disrespecting that whole story, it was because it was a white person.
Absolutely.
So we're still left behind. I feel like we're still left behind. We're still not part of the conversation. We're still an add-on. Our women and children are still dying, and no one's being held accountable.
No, I'm sorry that that's how you feel, and I completely understand and accept.
Not just how I.
No, sorry. That I accept your reality is what I'm saying. And we are working to change that, working to amplify those voices. And
It's not quick enough.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
not quick enough. We do know the answers. Just getting in, sometimes just getting in the Aboriginal voice or getting an Aboriginal voice, it's obviously not working. And so how do we make this work for our women and children? And it's not just the prevention, it's the housing, because we have nowhere to go, so they stay. It's the police, because we can't access them because they just don't believe or misidentify, or you're worried your children are going to be taken, or you're worried your man's going to end up in jail. These are the real on the ground issues. So I don't care if you have this great policy, unless you can implement it on the ground and women and children stop dying, nothing's going to work.
But it goes to your point around prevention. And prevention is absolutely the key. It's the thing that helps us be able to manage housing. It's the thing that helps us be able to manage how stories are received.
Systems talking in government. Like, are you talking to police? Are you talking to, I know you said you're talking to the Attorney General, the housing, you know, the fact that we heard evidence about ABIs for Aboriginal women, like, that's horrific.
Yeah, and
How
it
then
really
do they
is.
look after their children? How then do they keep their families going?
Well, how are they supported to look after their children?
Or even work? Most of them don't work because they can't get jobs due to racism.
But can I also ask you, you said that the numbers have gone up
Yeah,
of incidents of family violence.
of reported incidents.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you said that was because, but what is the evidence that it's actually because of greater awareness rather than an actual increase in violence? What's the evidence? How do you know
Yeah.
that?
The only evidence that you can really go on is anecdotal, because there isn't a recorded number of unreported incidents of violence.
that-
So it is around that anecdotal evidence that swirls around you that leads you to that conclusion.
It's a presumption rather than a direct fact.
It's impossible to establish as fact.
Doctor, you mentioned a little bit earlier about funding going to ACOs. Is that ongoing funding or is it pilot? What's the?
There is about 68% of the funding is ongoing,
Right.
and the remainder is fixed term. That might relate to a shorter term innovation that's being tested, but the majority, well, I guess 68% would be ongoing funding.
And this is to the minister though, but given the disproportionate or overrepresentation of our women in this particular area, is there funding equity going to make sure that Aboriginal organisations who are working to work through these significant issues, is there reasonable proportionality going to them given the overrepresentation? Because a lot of mainstream organisations get a lot of money to do stuff, but our organisations have to do the holistic approach, and it's appreciated, but it's not represented in the funding they receive.
So there was a review that was conducted by Ernst & Young, I think it was around about 2021, and that was one of the things that it looked at and made recommendations about. So the department brought in minimum of a 10% requirement of all funding that goes into family violence to be ensured that it is for First Peoples. It is hard to know the exact balance of proportionality when there's so much unrecorded incidents that we have, when there's so much unrecording. So is it in proportion to need? It's still not clear to me yet whether that is correct. But since that period, at least 10%, and I think at the moment it's around about 12% of the funding that goes to family violence overall goes towards First Nations, and majority of that is for ACOs.
And I'm not a mathematician, Minister, but if you were 45 times more likely to experience family violence and the complexity associated, 10% is probably not, not to be disrespectful, but it's not in proportionate.
No,
Proportionality is not there, really.
Yeah.
10% or 12%,
Yeah.
45 times more overrepresented. I'm not a mathematician. But
Just on that point is, so we have how many in each orange door?
Yep.
How many Aboriginal specific roles have you got?
It would depend on the size of the orange door, but there would generally be an Aboriginal practice lead, 2 Aboriginal practitioners. There could be a team leader if it's a bigger orange door. And I think that's.
I think it's about 68 positions across
Yeah.
the FTEs across the orange doors.
And how many orange doors are there?
18.
There's 18 hubs.
And are they specifically identified roles?
It's absolutely the decision of the ACO partner agency as to whether they're designated roles.
So out of those roles, out of the 68, how many are actually Aboriginal workers working in those roles?
We don't always have access to that data because it's ACO data and we don't necessarily know. It's their employee data.
So we don't even know if the Aboriginal roles are Aboriginal people in them.
We don't know for sure, but as I said, it's up to the partner agency, the ACO partner agency, about whether or not they do make those designated positions.
And do they have a specific caseload?
I don't believe they do, Commissioner, but I can definitely take that on notice and come back to you on it.
My thoughts go to the overrepresentation of our women. If they do obviously end up at Orange Door, then there would be disproportionate of those workers have a higher caseload and be overworked than the other agencies. And that goes back to the funding that Commissioner Lovett was just talking about.
That's possible. I can
I think
definitely
that's a fair observation.
for you. Yeah.
Dr. Heenan, obviously solving the problems of family violence is exceptionally complicated. I think that's obvious to everyone. But there seem to be some elements that are causing family violence problems that are much more straightforward and therefore easier to respond to effectively. And I notice in paragraph 6 of your statement, you say family violence is the leading cause of homelessness in Australia. So I'd ask you to explain what you mean by that, because the purpose of the question is that homelessness, if that is a driving force in the leading number of family violence issues, then it is soluble by government quite easily because it's purely a dollar solution. You don't need therapists, you don't need investigations, reviews or frameworks. It's just building houses, isn't it?
Well, it's so that comment in my statement is definitely drawing on what would be decades of research that would suggest family violence is a driver of homelessness. So the experiences of family violence lead to homelessness because it's mainly women and children who leave the violent household. So that's what I meant by that comment, that it's in that direction that homelessness can occur, because women and children, if they are seeking to flee or seeking to leave, will otherwise be homeless. In that broader sense, of course, there are other responses for women who are in fear of their lives, or who are at a point in their safety or risk concerns that would mean they would be going to a refuge.
So, and you go on to say it is a key driver of First Peoples children into out-of-home care. So, like, isn't it disgraceful that government, by not effectively funding homes, is causing children to be split up from their parents?
I think the experience of family violence is present for kids who are in out-of-home care. First Peoples children who are in out-of-home care have had experiences of family violence, have come from an experience of family violence. That's what I meant by that statement.
I'll just clarify, Commissioner, are you suggesting that you think that issues around housing instability are a contributing factor or cause violence in homes?
I think what
Is that,
Heenan has described, doesn't say that. I read it initially that way, but I think she is really saying that it's after family violence has been
that's right.
happened, then the problem is primarily homelessness that affects people in that situation. And she goes on to say, and it is the key driver of first people's children going into out-of-home care. And so I was wrong in directing providing homes as a means of preventing family violence, but I think, as I understand it, what you've been saying is that providing sufficient homes after the event would make a huge difference. It would prevent children being split up. And I mean, this is where the context of colonial history rears its head again. I mean, you can imagine how Aboriginal families who have a background of their children being stolen look at today's system as doing exactly the same thing. I mean, it's hard to underestimate the power of that feeling of exclusion, of discrimination.
Absolutely, absolutely accept that. But I'll go one step back though and say it is the use of violence in the home. It is those men who are choosing to use violence in those homes that starts that ripple effect.
But you've got to address the problem as it is today
Absolutely.
somewhere. And if it's no use saying, well, you know, we will address in the future men's bad behaviour. It's not going to help people who are in the, I don't know, in the last hour, 10 families that are affected by family violence today, now, and children who are being taken into out-of-home care in the last hour because of family violence. No use saying, oh, well, one day we'll you know, look at men's behaviour and try and fix it. I mean, yes, that's certainly a very valuable thing to do. But as of the last hour, there are people whose children are being walked across the road and put into out-of-home care when they wouldn't be if government provided houses. And that's what this statement clearly says. So there's no mystery about the solution to that problem. You know, there isn't a mystery, it's money. And that's what completely escapes me as to how the government comes to the Royal Commission and says, we know the answer. There's a lack of houses and there are Aboriginal children being stolen today because we're not providing houses. And we're still not providing houses. Well,
Commissioner, it's money, it's access to labour, it's access to materials, it's all of the things that come together that make it difficult to roll houses out as quickly as possible. I absolutely believe in public housing and absolutely would just like to see a lot of public housing. My mother grew up in public housing. It's something that is very important to me, and I would like to see as much of it built as is physically possible to build.
but you know, we've had ministers come along and liking all sorts of solutions, but it doesn't happen. You know, I mean, you can go away today and knock on the housing minister's door and say, look, my deputy secretary has told me of this problem. We need more houses, and you just have to do it. So maybe that's what you'll do when you leave.
Commissioners, I do
Had
want to
similar
return to the question of harm and prevalence of different types of harm and the intersection with housing issues, but I suggest it's an appropriate time to take a short break. So could we take 15 minutes for a morning break?
15 minutes. Second, quarter to 12. 11:45.
Thank you, Chair.
Adjourn. Thank you.
Name and the time.
I was still breathing.
Name and the time. Normally it's just 15.
You going all right?
Quarter to.
Yeah.
Chair.
Ready to commence, council. Thank you. This session of the Yoorrook Justice Commission has commenced.
Commissioners, I acknowledge that we're joined this morning by the Honourable Jennifer Cote-AO, Chair of the Victorian Law Reform Commission, who's joined us again this morning. Minister and Dr. Heenan, I wanted to ask you some generic questions around forms of harm, of family violence, and the drivers of harm. So can I start with questions around harm? We accept that harm, when we're talking about family violence, harm can take many forms, correct? Physical hurt and aggression, psychological, economic abuse and manipulation, coercive conduct or controlling behaviours, public humiliation, isolation, and increasingly digital harm, including the non-consensual sharing of images, and in the brave new world that we're in, deep fake porn and deep fake images, correct? Yep. And to understand that harm, is there any work done? Oh, sorry, I'll go back a step. Are family violence prevention strategies targeting behaviour by type? Do we have any understanding, or is our response to family violence generic across all types of harm?
To go to your question around prevention, there's multiple approaches that are used. That can be whether it is programs to enhance girls' wellbeing and sense of self and empowerment, which is what we see some of our DELGA action groups have engaged in their regions, or whether it is the respectful relationship work that is across the majority of our schools, whether it is in the work that we do with our sporting codes and sporting clubs at a grassroots level, whether it's the work we're doing at local government level around prevention. It is around recognising that about the importance of respect is probably the central tenet that comes into much of the prevention work that is done, and that's whether it's respect for self and empowerment of self and understanding what is acceptable and isn't acceptable behaviour in what you experience, but also helping others, primarily boys and men, understand the importance of respect, the importance of equality, and the importance of also recognising the different forms of violence, identifying different forms of violence, understanding the hurt that causes, but also really understanding that it is a choice, that behaviour is a choice that you make and that doesn't need to be made.
So that group of responses assumes that lack of respect underpins all forms of family violence. Would that be fair?
Yep.
And doesn't necessarily result in family violence, but at least underlines or is the baseline problem for all family violence.
Yes.
And is the response to that generically to address that lack of respect that you've mentioned? Is there any other response that targets, for example, bullying in the cyberspace, escalation of behaviours from controlling, isolating to physical violence? Are the plans and strategies at the moment targeting the types of harm beyond respect?
Yeah, and it's a fair point because it's important to be nimble and to try to be nimble. And this is what we are trying to do. And with respectful relationships, there has been a broad brush that is worked within individual schools and the needs of those schools, but there also now has to be an additional layer, which is what we're in the process of developing around that those online threats that you mentioned, for example. So where we've got the emergence of these really terrible social media influencers, and I'm not going to use names I'm not going to add to the amplification of who they are, but when you've got really harmful, for example, male behaviours being used as social influencers and being used in a way to pretend that it is about healthy masculinity. So you see with online influencers that they use their own form of bringing into their cult, if you like, which is to be a healthy man, you need to have a healthy physicality. This is how you can be, look after yourself, do some workouts, do this, eat well. You want to be a successful man, it will mean that you need to have economic power. This is how you can look after your investments. This is how you can do this. But the subtext of everything, even the umbrella over it all, is that for you to be a powerful male means that you have to subjugate women. And this has been behaviour that we are seeing seeping into our schools and with our boys, which is awful. It's awful. There's been some really interesting research done by Jesuit Social Services around attitudes, and it does talk about this creeping pervasiveness of thought that these social influences are bringing into our communities. And so within respectful relationships, we know that we've got to think about this even more and really start to create more programs that address what is happening online and help our kids respond to it and help them recognise that they could be heading into an unsafe space online, that you could be shifting your algorithms to get even more of this stuff by acting in a certain way or clicking on certain things, how to help them feel safe online, but also how to help them recognise how those things that they're repeatedly seeing online are reprogramming their brains and their thoughts in really unhealthy ways.
But just to come back to the point of my question.
I'm so sorry.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to be critical because that's very useful information in terms of responses. Is there any analysis of the data in any way that points to the types of harm being directed at First Nations women and children, or is it a generic treatment that all these behaviours are treated the same way?
It's an interesting question. I think that there is within the programs that are delivered by our ACOs, absolutely that lens. In terms of respectful relationships, the conversation is a broad arch of respect and respect for everybody. I'm not familiar, it's education who runs it, and I'm not familiar if there are components within that speaks directly to First Nations in a broader approach. So I'm not able to answer that question adequately, I'm sorry.
Dr. Heenan, do you have anything to add there?
I think what I'd say, Ms. McLeod, is that there are different program responses, I guess, whether they're at that very front end, so primary prevention responses that will go to attitudes, behaviours, trying to shift attitudes and behaviours so that risk is reduced of disrespect, of entitlement, power and control being used over women and girls. But I think in terms of early intervention, for example, First Nations providers are working with adolescents who may be exhibiting some risk behaviours or who they're concerned about in terms of, so it might be the referrals have come into those services because there are behaviours which are starting to exhibit that sense of lack of respect, or it could be, and it will be as a result of all manner of drivers for First Nations people. Always has to have the overlays of experiences of intergenerational trauma. It might be that family violence is in the home, that those young people will be going to a program that's trying to address in an early intervention sense and in a therapeutic way some of those behaviours or attitudes that might be starting to form. So I think to your question in relation to are there different approaches for different contexts or harm, then I think yes, from the response end, so if we're talking around victim survivor harm and all of the impacts around harm you spoke of, social, physical, economic, spiritual, all harm that might be caused for victim survivors, how that presents for them and how the kinds of support needs, the kinds of interventions that they will want to engage with could be quite different. And same as the Minister has said, for people who are using violence, it will be, you're trying to match a certain kind of presentation, I guess, as a practitioner with the right intervention. So if it's a person using violence or a First Nations person using violence, then it may be healing holistic programs or timeout services that may be appropriate in those instances.
So what I'm hearing from what you've both said is that there's an understanding of harm taking different forms. and then a response to that harm, which might be specific to the sort of services and that the person needs delivered through the ACOs. But with respect, it sounds like it's a patchwork response.
I don't think so much it's a patchwork response. I mean, I think that within the education around respect is a recognition of the intersectionality that comes with respect. So whether it's gender respect, whether it is calling out racism, whether it's calling out intolerances for anybody in our community, that is within respectful relationships as I understand it. And that is a universal approach, but yes, it is tailored amongst communities and particular pressure points, if you like, within communities. So what you might see in respectful relationships in a community like mine might be different to something that you would see in a different community, a different part of Melbourne that's got different needs, different cohorts of people.
So does respectful relationships teach concepts of racism and discrimination and have strategies around anti-racism and discrimination?
I can't talk with accuracy because I'm not, because it comes out of Department of Education, I don't have a strong overview over respectful relationships. But I understand that within respectful relationships is gender equality, but also other forms of inequality as well.
And other forms of
Yeah.
inequality. So perhaps we need to ask the Department of Education about that. With respect, and correct me if I'm wrong, this still sounds like the teaching of respect generically is a prime strategy, but there is no consideration of the types of harm that are confronting First Nations women and children. Would that be fair?
I would think the multiple areas of harm that First Nations women can experience. No, I think that would be a correct observation that you've made.
Yep. And in order to understand how to address that harm, we need to know that, don't we?
Yep.
And we also need to know about the prevalence of prevailing causes and conditions. You mentioned the behaviour being a choice, but we need to understand prevalence of drug and alcohol use, for example, don't we? We need to understand prevalence of mental health, acquired brain injury, and other emotional deregulators, if I can use that generically.
Yep.
We need to understand those factors in order to address causes, don't we?
In the sense that the underlying cause, and I know that there will be different views within the sector around this. So this is the view that I hold, is that the underlying cause is still inequality. And whether you look at alcohol and other drug use, whether you look at trauma, whether you look at mental health issues, whether you look at cognitive impairment, they are, for want of a better term, enablers for those choices. But the origins of the choice are in inequality.
And is that concept broadly accepted in the community, including the criminal justice system?
I don't know that it's broadly accepted within the community, because if it was, I would hope not see the levels of violence that we do see. Whether it's held in corrections, I can't speak to the views that people in corrections might have.
So family violence is a choice at heart. How are the programs identifying when and how those choices are made and how we address them?
That's a really hard question. When and how those choices are made is really hard to answer when you're talking about over 57,000 people and why they're responding in the way that they are. And there is, and Dr. Heenan might want to speak to this further, but there is a diversity of research when it comes to the drivers of violence and what is behind violence. One of the challenges that you have in this research area is you can talk to the sector, you can talk to people who work in this area and get their views. But when it comes to talking to those people who are using violence, there is a reluctance, even after doing a program or having engagement or going through the justice system, to then talk about your behaviour and why you behaved in that way. So to get information that goes beyond a small group of people that may be from different backgrounds, that may have a whole number of different stories, to try and get information that is consistent, that gives you a measurable cohort, it's really difficult. But this is one of the interesting things to explore is, for example, the work that Dadi Manwaro are doing, and the fact that the work that they do with those men who have used violence, where you see them confident and trusting enough to be able to talk about the choices that they've made in the past and be able to articulate them, there you can see that there is a pathway for us to be able to understand more about this behaviour and to be able to get more information, because you've got a rebuilding of men where they are able to actually tell you what has gone on with them. So I don't know if you want to talk more about understanding of people using violence.
Thanks, Minister. I just would add, I think from your question, Ms McLeod, in relation to, I guess, the suite of responses that are available if we're talking about the individual person who's using violence, and to take Dadi again, they would also offer case management specifically for those users of violence if case management is the best approach for that person. It could be that they're assessed by the program provider as being ready for program, so more group program work, so men's behaviour change programs, or it could be holistic healing. It very much depends on the needs that are presenting for the person who's using violence in this instance, the kind of drivers and triggers that are being identified for that behaviour. There will be at its heart those structural issues in relation to use of power and control, gender inequality, but the very specific antecedents for a particular perpetrator, in this case a First Nations perpetrator who might be with a Dadi Manwaro provider, that provider will work with that person to assess which is the best program to be able to address the particular context and circumstances for that person, who also then has a context and the person themselves, as the Minister has said, will be feeling culturally far safer in that environment to be able to talk about their full lives, their full selves.
So the commissioners may have some questions about those programs and the success of those programs, but if we accept that a large percentage, perhaps a majority of offenders against Aboriginal women and children are not Aboriginal,
Yes.
and we accept that the choice to use family violence is a choice, how do you find out what's driving family violence? Who is asking the question, and who should be asking the question, why did you do this?
I think the question gets asked a lot.
At what level and where?
I think it gets asked from Victoria Police on upwards. I think that people who use violence are regularly asked, why did you use violence? And I think that for me, one of the learnings and one of the things that I want us to think more about is some of the work that Dadi are doing, in the sense that I think that with men's behaviour change, for example, they start from the premise of accountability and wanting to have that at the very start. Whereas with Dadi, it's building that relationship and that connection and that trust, which then gives men that freedom, that safety of being able to really think, why did I act in that way? Why did I make that choice? So I think that in terms of going out into the broader community and the way that we do work with men using violence, that there is some ongoing work to do with men's behaviour change around the approach that we use, because there is that anger, there is that desire to know, why did you do this? How do I hold you accountable for that choice that you made? And it's at what point we separate that anger and focus on, how do we understand this person? How do we connect and get trust with this person so that we can then really understand what has gone on to lead to that choice.
I take it you would accept that this piece of work is critical in order to effectively address the crisis that we're seeing in this state.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that, so I think within the statistics that we've got, that many incidents are one-off and many incidents don't reoccur in terms of people using violence. But we know that there is a considerable number of people who are repeat offenders. So a part of prevention work is also that understanding and accountability process and that changing of behaviours.
I think that's really important because we're talking about MARAM, removing women and children from the home. They seem to be the ones held accountable, even to the point of getting their children removed.
Mm.
And so they're being held accountable, and we've got all these programs around, I get it, keeping them safe, but the cause is not being addressed because the men are getting away with it. And look, Dadi do good work for Aboriginal men, but most of those users of violence for Aboriginal women are not Aboriginal men.
That's right.
So Dadi can do the work with mob and bring culture in and the respect for women, and because that's what they're going to do.
Mm.
But on the other hand, if we're saying that most perpetrators of or users of violence against Aboriginal women are not, what are we doing in that space?
No, you're absolutely right, Commissioner Hunter, and this is where I think that we can actually learn from what Dadi are doing in terms of how we apply their practices and their techniques more broadly.
Well, then we need to just do it because it's just keeps getting talked about, and I just feel the ones that hold the weight are the women and the children.
Yep.
That have to move.
Yeah. It's so hard to understand this behaviour, these choices that are made. And it's the challenge, one of the challenges that we've got is that A, there's not comprehensive research, but B, there isn't a long history of this research either. And again, because the focus has always been on the women, not on the male's behaviour, that reluctance to accept that behaviour and those choices.
It feels like the women end up holding the
100%.
accountability for what's happened. And in my working life, I don't know how many times we've seen women moved out of their home,
Their
to
kids out
either
of
a
their schools.
refuge. Well, what's even worse is the children end up in care. And actually, sorry, just on that, can I just ask, do you have statistics on how many Aboriginal women have gone into Orange Door
Mhm.
and then had their children removed? Do we have any statistics, Aboriginal women specifically?
I'm not aware of that occurring, but I'm happy to be corrected.
Yeah, I know that there's in the last year there's been I think 14,000 First Nations people come to the Orange Door. I think that's about 7.5% of all of those people that have come to the Orange Door. I'm not aware of a child protection referral being made from the Orange Door to child protection. Certainly child protection refers into the Orange Door to the extent that that will then become a non-statutory system response, because there's both family violence, integrated family services, services for people who use violence, as well as the Aboriginal specific teams, to be able to then look at a response that is not a child protection response.
We have heard evidence that there has been children removed once they've approached Orange Door.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to follow that up because I'd like to know more about that.
Because why have a service that our people can't attend?
Yes.
Because they're scared their children are going to be.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't want that view to be entrenched.
No. So
No.
I'd like if you could.
Yeah, no, can we follow that up? I would like to know more about that, please.
The related point is that we've also heard that many people occupying roles that are supposed to be Aboriginal intake officers are not First Peoples.
Okay.
They have a job title,
Yeah,
but they are not First Peoples.
I'm sorry, that's the case.
Aboriginal led practice lead. So could we get something? I know obviously it goes back to ACOs, but you have the overview of that system. It'd be good to know in those Aboriginal roles how many Aboriginal workers, because these are vulnerable women
Absolutely, Commissioner. It is the home agency carries that data. So we haven't. I think the home agency has in terms of the Orange Door relationship, it is a self-determined approach to the Aboriginal response teams in the Orange Doors. So we don't have access to, and nor have we ever sought to know whether the positions are filled by First Nations people.
Just again, evidence that we've heard is a person that's presented twice there has never had an Aboriginal practice lead that is not Aboriginal. And then the third time was put off to another agency because that Aboriginal practice lead also had too much of a caseload. So I think this needs to be looked at, the caseload.
Yep.
Are they, I know you leave it up to the ACOs, but I would assume an Aboriginal practice lead would be an Aboriginal person, because you can't call it an Aboriginal practice lead if they're not Aboriginal.
Completely agree. Completely agree. And I would also hope with the investment that we've put into ACOs to strengthen their workforce and to bring them up to the mandatory minimum qualifications, that we would be seeing growth in first people who are who are working in the sector. So, but I do want to keep the conversation going with you. If you can give me that information, I very much would like to know more about what has been said so that I can be aware of it.
Yep.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I'm really still grappling within my mind about the preventative area and the education, because, you know, Aboriginal women 45 times more likely to come in to have family violence, and yet we're doing this broad brush, generic kind of education on respectful relationships. So clearly there's a deep-seated work or thinking that needs to be embedded into respectful relationships, in particular about Aboriginal women.
I'd be
The
happy to.
statistic says that.
Yep.
I'm also deeply concerned to hear, though, that you are the minister responsible. All ministers are responsible for addressing family violence. I will say that, but you're the lead for family violence. And then when you'd mentioned about the Department of Education and the work that they're doing there, you don't really have a say in that. That's a bit of a concern, given the department, and we've got experts who've got 30 plus years. They should be developing and designing the programs that are being implemented, whether it be in school curriculum or not. So we don't have a good history in the schooling system, and we had the Deputy Premier here come and apologise for the systemic racism and from the education point of view, and not teaching our culture, our practice, but also the true history of Victoria. And I think that's something that is really important to us. And then again, we further embed that our women are not represented around being respectful to our women and valuing them. One of the other things I do want to raise is not to take away from women, but we also have Aboriginal men who suffer from family violence. And we also have LGBTIQ plus communities also that haven't been represented, that aren't represented in that respectful relationships as well. But I think I guess I'm asking for a commitment for you to go and work with the Deputy Premier on having deeper dialogue and conversations about what does respectful relationships look like in the schools, and making sure that Aboriginal representation is embedded in that work, because, you know, 45 times more likely. It's just,
Yep.
you know, it can't just be generic when it comes to our people, you know.
Absolutely. Thank you. And it is a conversation that has begun with me and the Deputy Premier, and it is one that I want to strengthen. And take your point on board, absolutely, and I will give you that undertaking.
Yeah, because the department education should have come to you to get clarity, the experts in this area or industry, or I don't know how to articulate that very well, but key people who are leading in family violence advocacy to make sure that what they're teaching is appropriate. And if your department's not involved in that, then I don't have confidence that it's appropriate. And nor is it either then even further tailored to our people over-representation. Again, non-Aboriginal people are doing a lot of these behaviours towards our women. Not all, there is Aboriginal men doing this. We recognise and understand that, but we're just not represented.
With respectful relationships, it's often a third party that will come into the school and deliver the program, and
Yep.
they're the ones who will connect with the department, who will connect with Respect Victoria, and who will connect with other academics and experts in the field. I don't know if you want to elaborate any further on that.
Pardon me, sorry. I was going to say, Commissioner, that there is a broader prevention approach, alongside education and schools, I guess, and Delta has been leading some really important prevention work for many years now. They're just going through the process of refreshing their primary prevention framework, which gets at some of the issues, Ms. McLeod, that you were speaking of in terms of what are the drivers. Primary prevention frameworks, and I understand the issue read multiple frameworks being referenced, but this has been a really important framework led by Delta, where there has been an evidence base, so looking at the primary drivers of violence, of family violence, and looking at the responses from the individual level through to the societal level, basing that in the context of First Nations experiences of family violence, and noting that non-First Nations people, men in particular, are offending often. So that is a framework that's literally being developed now. I don't think it's quite landed yet, but the Delta and the responsible sub-working group has been working very hard on that prevention framework. And the idea is then to use that evidence base to then drive prevention programs across settings. So education is one very important setting, and Respect for Relationships education programs has been running in Victorian schools now for a number of years. But there is also sports settings, workplaces, local councils, another area, but sports, I guess, as a particular area that I think First Nations program designers have done really strong work in recognising what the drivers are, but also being able to have the conversations, develop the program approaches that then can reduce the likelihood of the participants going on to develop attitudes or continue to develop attitudes and behaviours that might lead to violence.
Still feels like for me though, and I did ask the question, I know you responded to council here, but I did ask the question, but it still seems like it's a bit of an afterthought, Doctor, all this. So like we've been overrepresented in this area for before the statistics anyway. We already know that. We're talking about colonisation. It was embedded in both your statements.
Mm-hmm.
And it just feels all the time that anything to do with our people, it's we'll hand it over to the expert organisations as an afterthought. This should have been embedded in when you just said that it's been in schooling or in education facilities for years, and yet we're now developing a framework for Aboriginal people. Again, we are not at the forefront. We are overrepresented in everywhere, but then we have to go off and then further develop and define and give you the guidance, and then it's still not represented.
Just so we understand that it's since colonisation, there's some work done by Larissa Brent, and so I just want to quote her so people understand. Just as the invading colonists saw Aboriginal land as theirs for the taking, so too they assumed that they could do as they wished with Aboriginal women without fear of interference from British law. This is nothing new for our women. And I feel like we're just getting words and words and words, and we understand and we've got to change, but it's not changing. And we're so frustrated because I don't want to hear of another Aboriginal woman dying at the hands of family violence and to everybody be silent on the issue again.
No, I don't either.
But it's going to happen because we're moving too slow. Mr. McLeod asked, what are the drivers? If we need to understand this and do more research, then that's what we've got to do. What are the drivers? If it's taking the model of Darty, why aren't we working with Darty? Because our children are going into care as a consequence and dying. I don't want any more coroners' findings and inquests. We don't need another Royal Commission. We know what the problems are. We need to address them, and we need to make sure we're putting the right money in the right places. Because if it, What hope have we got for our kids if this is, you know, I had to have the conversation with my daughter the other day about when you catch a tram, put one thing in. Make sure your surroundings, don't be kind to anybody, stop talking.
Don't have a ponytail.
Well, don't even put your Aboriginal flag on your bag, right? Take that off as well. So add that on top, how it feels for our Aboriginal young girls, let alone the mums and dads telling them that you have to do this.
Absolutely.
I don't want to have these conversations 20 years from now, or my daughter having conversations with her daughter. We shouldn't have to have them.
Agreed. I don't want her to have to do that either.
I don't want any child or any woman, but unfortunately that's where we're at. So we just need to move forward with all of these, you know, we're so risk adverse. The problem is we're that risk averse that people are still dying. The system is not working. We should be working with health professionals as well, and we haven't even spoken about that.
So coming back to the Respectful Relationships resource that's available online, we see a number of references to discrimination generically, but there's no reference in that document that I could find to race, racism, First Nations people, Aboriginality, safety, cultural safety, any of those issues. So do you think it's beyond the initial acknowledgement of First Nations people?
I'm so sorry. I didn't understand which document you were referring to. Sorry.
The Respectful Relationships resource.
Oh, got you.
Yeah. No mention apart from the initial we acknowledge.
Acknowledgement. Yeah.
No reference to race or racism.
So that's the broad policy document, or
That's the teaching resource.
other teaching resource.
Resource kit for Victorian schools.
Okay.
Yeah. So discrimination described in the broad, should there be a reference to race, racism, to First Nations people, the disproportionate effect of family violence on those women and children?
Absolutely.
Ms. McLeod, just before you move on, I wanted to ask a question relating to the previous discussion about the drivers. And I just wondered whether, like, it wouldn't be a surprise if substance abuse, mental illness would be a feature of many of the family violence incidents that you get. I'm just wondering whether you have data on those types of elements that happen in a family violence situation.
I guess, Commissioner, those drivers have been recognised in the primary prevention framework that has been developed. So in a public health sense, there was some public health work done through Vic Health in developing the primary prevention framework, and those contributing factors were identified.
But this is the framework that's in development, is that?
No, this is a framework that was developed by Vic Health in 2008. The framework that I was referring to was the Indigenous Primary Prevention Framework that's actually going through a refresh. So it was first established in 2012.
So is there data that's revealed by that framework about the incidence of, you know, substance abuse, mental illness in family violence incidents?
In terms of the public health work that was done, those drivers were, there was quite a complicated piece of work to look at what are the greatest contributors to poor health in women. And violence was identified as the lead contributor to poor health in women. And then those other drivers were also active or contributing factors, and certainly were also experienced by victim survivors in terms of harm
We're
caused.
talking about perpetrators.
Yes.
So can I
There
assist?
is data that talks about those intersections. I can't tell you that data, but I think broadly it can be around about a third of incidents. There can be a presence of drugs and alcohol, for example, but that's an additional layer of the primary cause. Because, for example, Commissioner, you might be at the football and had a couple of drinks, and you're not necessarily, I'm not getting my own way, so I'm going to whack the bloke next to me, but you might go home and do it. That's the choice. or part of the choice, right? You're not doing it with your mate because he's your mate and you respect him. You'll go home and do it.
I just came back to the, to yourself, to go back to the respectful relationship stuff that you were talking about before.
Yes, I was going to go on to the work of Professor Fitzgibbon, but if you want to ask that question about the respectful relationships, Commissioner.
No, that's fine.
So you'd be familiar with the work recently published, or at least reported in the media, of Professor Fitzgibbon and her team at Monash University.
Yes.
And it wouldn't surprise you, from the sounds of it, that we've asked her to produce overnight, so you may not have seen this breakdown of data, but within the wider sample of 265 cases, she reviewed sentencing remarks for those cases. There were 19 cases of intimate femicide involving a male perpetrator and a First Nations female victim. In 95% of cases, the judge noted the perpetrator had a history of drug or alcohol abuse. In 95% of cases, the perpetrator was drug or alcohol affected at the time of the femicide. In 47% of the cases, the judge stated the victim had a history of drug and alcohol abuse. And in 84% of cases, the victim was drug or alcohol affected at the time of the femicide. They also noted 84% of cases, the user of family violence had a prior interaction with the legal setting. These are specific to Aboriginal women, these are not the generic, although the findings are consistent. The user of family violence had a prior interaction with the police in 89% of cases, and the user of family violence had at least one prior conviction for family violence in 95% of cases. In 53% of cases, the user of family violence had victimised other intimate partners in addition to the femicide victim. So that tells us very starkly that drug and alcohol use and repeat offending are primary areas of concern and focus, don't they?
Yep.
And what is the state doing, either directly or by investing in the work of others, to address those specific risk factors?
There's a number of programs and supports that are there for drug and alcohol use and abuse, for example, but it's not something over which I have a lot of knowledge of, because it really falls within the Department of Health's remit. But there is within a number of the programs that we have for people using violence, that acknowledgement and work that is done in a therapeutic sense to address those additional layers of challenges that those people might experience.
Let's set aside the therapeutic response to drug and alcohol, absolutely appropriate. Let's come to the serial offending.
Yep.
How can you use this data, which tells us so clearly that one person might repeat offence against a single affected family member, or might offend against a series of women that he's in a relationship with? What does that tell us about the efficacy of our response and where we need to target the response?
We need to continue to have a multi-pronged approach to response. And the data and the understanding around this behaviour is emerging. So we need to keep building on it and keep understanding more. So this research work that has been done is useful in continuing to inform our understanding of the behaviours and what is happening around that person and the way that they're engaging. But we know, for example, through the central information point, the data that we have there, we know that there is a cohort that continue to use violence on different women. And they're really complicated people to work with. And we've got the Changing Ways program, where we've got 3 pilot programs that are happening across the state, including one that is being operated by Dadi Manwaro, to look at how we can better address those repeat offenders, those people who are a serious risk, how we understand their behaviours and how we work with them to change those behaviours.
Would you agree that if this is a primary driver of family violence, it requires a substantial response, including significant devotion of resources?
It needs a significant response in the sense that we have to do more work and harder work in understanding how to change those behaviours and how to stop the violence from happening. And I don't think that there has been enough information, enough research for us to be able to fully understand the silver bullet, if you like, to resolve this behaviour. So we are undertaking perpetrator research so that we do understand this more. I know ANROS is doing some work in terms of understanding perpetrators, because there just is not enough information worldwide to help us understand the hows, the wheres and the whys. Or that we understand the hows, sorry, but you know, the whys.
It's traditionally the questions around understanding perpetrators, has that been something of a no-go zone? Is it sort of sacred turf we dare not ask, or is it just not understood?
I think it's both. And I don't know, I think it goes to Commissioner Hunter's point earlier, which is the focus has always been on victim survivors, the women. It's always the women carrying the load instead of the lens going back to where the problem started, which is those choices of those men who are using violence. And it's only recently, and as we've come out of the Royal Commission, the gaze on those people using violence has become stronger and stronger and stronger. So there is data and information that we've accumulated in the 8 years since the Royal Commission, but there is still so much more to understand.
So is respectful relationship the panacea, or are there programs that you're aware of here or overseas that you would like to see explored and implemented?
I haven't seen yet programs internationally that would stand out for me that does offer a silver bullet. I don't think there is one. I think that it goes to a comment I made earlier around a whole of community response, and it's how we touch every part of community to get them all onto the same page that this behaviour is not acceptable.
And I suggest, and it's, that there has been critique of these approaches from many scholars, feminist scholars and others, that respectful relationships, while understanding that respect is, it's a very white middle class approach that really doesn't get to the life world of many of the people who are both users of violence and those who suffer from its effects. And that if that is the primary approach of the state, while I certainly don't think we should be doing training of that, it just seems incredibly inadequate and incredibly simplistic in its hope that somehow this is going to make a difference on its own. Yes, we should be training everybody to have respectful relationships, but I can't see that this is going to address this incredible problem, especially with the data from Ms. McLeod about the heavy involvement of drugs and alcohol and mental health and previous involvement in the law in femicide.
No, you're right, Commissioner. And that's why it's looking at sporting clubs and the role that they can play and the conversations that they have and how they are supporting their men and boys. It's, you know, one thing that we need to think about was an observation that was made to us by a couple of boys who had been doing respectful relationships, which was the lack of positive male role models. They weren't able to identify for us positive male role models that they looked up to, of whose behaviour they wanted to emulate. That is something that as a community, we've really got to think about how we address, because it isn't just respectful relationships. It is how we bring up healthy kids. It's how we help kids understand their entitlement and their privilege. It's how we help kids understand how to be better around each other. It's also how we help kids to self-regulate and care for themselves. So there's multiple levers in terms of prevention that we need to pull, and we're pulling as many of them as we can. Respectful relationships is just one component.
Can I just stay with the data for a moment? Recently announced a parliamentary inquiry, the Legal and Social Issues Committee, seeking submissions on family violence perpetrator data. And you'll be familiar, Minister, with the terms of the reference of that committee. The committee seeks data to acquire data to accurately understand the profile and volume of perpetrators of family violence in Victoria you've mentioned the 57,000 users already, but this is a refinement of that
Yes.
data, correct? The committee seeks input on the mechanisms for capturing this data, what data is collected, who collects it, what the data is used for, and the barriers to collecting the data specific to the family violent context. So could you just both give us your reflection on how the department, the work of the department and the work of the ACOs will be assisted by the committee work here?
I welcome the work that the committee is doing because I think it will be helpful in us trying to find all of the various data points that we can so that we can have an accurate measure of the people using violence that we have in this state and how to actually start to use that as one of our reference points as to measuring success. So they, as I understand it, have called for submissions. I think there's been in excess of 70 sent through. The department is working on their submission to the inquiry at the moment. I understand ACOs have been producing, have made submissions, and I understand that the committee will be having hearings and will be engaging with ACOs and wanting to further understand the questions they need to ask in the first
What's the
instance.
broad timeline for that?
I think they're reporting back at the end of the year, but it's common with committee inquiries. They can often be extended as more information comes in. And I think that as information continues to come in, the amount of time that they will need to digest and process that information may mean that they will need an extension.
So the commission can navigate parliamentary privilege issues. Would you be content to share the department's submission to that committee when it's available?
Absolutely.
Just turning then to the Delta agreement. This is a 3-year action plan that sits beneath that agreement, correct?
Yes, a 3-year action plan that sits beneath the 10-year agreement, exactly.
And at the time of your witness statement, Minister, the second plan was still in draft. You anticipated that would be finalised by mid-2024. So I was just going to follow up and ask, has that been now finalised?
Yeah, the second action plan was accepted by the forum in April.
Pardon me, Minister.
No, it's all right.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay. 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 Yes, we might bring up that document if we can, which is the acquittal of the Jeltja action plan. I'll just
So the first action plan.
Yeah, I'll just find the number.
No, look, some. This one.
This is document 9 in the tender bundle. It is DFFH.0027.0001.0143. And I should ask while we're turning up that acquittal, it's a purple document with boxes on it. Oh, there it is on the screen.
It's always font too small for me to read, so I have cheat
Exactly.
sheets.
I'll ask the operators to zoom in at the appropriate time.
That's all right.
I know we've gone over time, so I should just ask if you're okay to continue for a short time.
Yep, sure. Yep.
So we see on the screen the acquittal for each of the items under the action plan. The first is strategic priority number 1, Aboriginal culture and leadership with key achievements. And if we scroll down to the bottom box, status at conclusion of plan, add activities, 4 completed, 4 carried over. So my first question is, does each of these action plan have a timeline for each of these activities specifically?
It would depend on the activity and it would depend on the direction of the forum and the Koori caucus within the forum, would be my understanding around timelines.
Yeah, it would have, and I don't have that in front of me, it would have had which year the various actions were to be acquitted in. That's right.
So this acquittal document doesn't tell us whether these things are on track or not, just that half of the ones in the first column have been completed and 4 carried over. So can you tell us whether they're on track or whether they are behind those 4 that were carried over?
The 4 that were carried over into the second action plan,
Yes.
we're still in the first year of the second action plan. So, so they would still be, I guess, I'd have to see where they're positioned within the 3 years for this current action plan to be able to tell you whether the 4 are on track or not, or whether they were to be acquitted in year 1.
I would suspect that some of them, and I can't tell you which ones, are not on track, and in part that was through some of the challenges with COVID and COVID restrictions.
But could you, Dr. Heenan, undertake to give us a version of this acquittal that sets out what the original timelines were, and whether those things that have been rolled over into the second action plan were delayed for some reason?
I'm not sure that I'll be able to do that at such a specific level, Ms. McLeod. I will be able to talk to you about some of the specific actions, I guess, and those that have been carried over or those that have been committed to core business, if that's helpful. But I wouldn't be able to say which year each action was intended to be acquitted in at this time.
Can I just say, wouldn't that be a core thing when you're planning and you're putting your actions in, that you actually have a timeline and the key outcomes and you would know when they're supposed to be done by?
Belcher does have that, Commissioner Walter, yeah, in terms of the actual plan itself. So the full document, there would be a commitment to which year it was proposed that action be undertaken and completed by.
Yeah, I've been reading the JILCA monitoring and accountability plan, and I just have some real concerns that the indicators that are in there are very vague, and there doesn't seem to be any actual measurement applied to them, so that you won't be able to actually say whether they've been. So, for example, under the key thing of Aboriginal individuals, families and community outcomes and indicators are that Aboriginal people have greater access to family protection. There's increased, now they're just vague statements. What does increased mean? 10%
Yes.
over 3 years, 15%? What does greater access mean? Does that mean there's a 20% more Aboriginal women accessing these services? I'm not sure how you can actually say whether you've succeeded or not when you don't have any bars of measurement.
Yes.
What success looks like.
Yes, I think, Commissioner Walter, that's exactly what the evaluation that's almost completed for the first action plan suggested, that the MEAP, the Monitoring, Evaluation and Accountability Plan, was too high level in that it didn't have sufficient indicators or measures included within it. And so the evaluator, it was an Aboriginal-led evaluation, does talk about MEAP being useful to the extent that they intended that, and in fact have endeavoured to align it with MEAP as much as possible, but otherwise needed to use other reference points as it happened to be able to look at the levels of success or progress that were made on various actions.
We have heard repeatedly in this commission of evaluation and monitoring of Aboriginal programs constantly failing in this regard. It's a pattern. We have yet to see a framework or a program or a strategy that actually has measurable outcomes that would indicate whether that framework and strategy was a success. And that's even just in the ones that actually have some sort of evaluation built into them. So I just can't understand why you would have a monitoring, evaluation and accountability plan that was not able to measure whether it was successful or not. It seems not to have been meeting its core purpose.
Yes, I agree. I think it's just, and that was definitely the view of the partnership forum, that when it came to being able to trying to apply MEAP to the first action plan, and noting that MEAP is intended to look at the whole of the 10-year strategy, but even looking at action plan by action plan, it's not going to be sufficient. And so Belcher are in the process under its strategic priority, looking at data innovation to develop indicators and measures of success that are far more sensitive to the particular activity that's been identified, particularly for the second action plan.
Can you give me a timeline of when those will be developed?
I can come back to you once Delta has and Kuri Caucus have agreed that. I understand that that they plan to have that done within the next couple of months, certainly by the end of the calendar year.
But it's the job of the department, isn't it? Not the JOPA forum to do this job.
Or we're absolutely agree with you in terms of supporting that work. It is absolutely self-determined work, though, in terms of the measures of success and indicators that Delta would like to identify. And they've already identified a number of them through the programs that they have been running. But we support as Secretariat and as the department, alongside the Aboriginal-led Secretariat, the work as it progresses, definitely.
Are you able to tell us what sort of things those 8 activities are? I mean, is it a 10-minute hello in a passageway, or what are they?
I can give you an indication of some of them, definitely, because some of them are quite substantial. For example, in the area of the service delivery strategy, it was actually the establishment of the Aboriginal access points. So that was one of the strategic activities that fell under strategic priority 3 for the action plan. So there was also the establishment of the Aboriginal specific sexual assault services that was achieved during the first action plan.
Were they recorded anywhere that we can see those outcomes?
I think those 2 were captured in that diagram. I think under it might have been the 3rd or the 4th in terms of the Aboriginal access points feature under priority 4. So that's.
I'm looking at priority 1 and that reference to 8 activities. Are they described anywhere that we can see them?
Not on that slide, they're not. No,
We can get you that information,
Yeah.
Commissioner.
Yeah, and that what we've done is pull out, I guess, the key achievements from the 8, but we can certainly go through item by item if you like.
I think that would be
in terms of
useful
we
for
will
me.
provide that.
Yep, thank you.
Just generically, under each of the headings, strategic priorities, there are a number of action items rolled over to the second action plan.
There are.
Correct?
There are.
And it would be useful to know for each of those whether they're on track, or whether they're delayed but for some reason.
Yeah, we'll be able to provide that to you.
Yeah.
You go to strategic priority 5, right? And the key achievements, they're done in the last.
Is your microphone on, Commissioner Levitt?
Just talking about strategic priority 5, and we look at the key achievements, that's an after fact. Monitoring, evaluation and accountability, that's just outsourcing that to another organisation to do. So you've had 3 years to do that. It's pretty easy to kind of achieve that. Aboriginal-led process of evaluation, like those 2 are done right at the end. So I come back to 3 completed, 12 activities, 3 completed. Well, 2 of them are right there. But again, it's the end of life cycle. And then we say, right, we should do an evaluation. Pretty easy to achieve those by just paying for an evaluation, to be fair. Any response, Doctor?
I'm hesitating, Commissioner, because I know it was work that was, and I know this might frustrate you, I apologise, but it was really important work that Delta sub-working group did over the course of the action plan. So MEAP was, it's a very big, substantial document. There was a lot of work and dialogue across that sub-working group that they brought back to Delta Partnership Forum to talk about its progress at various points. So I accept, though, that your point in relation to it featuring at the end of the plan's life.
Well, but also if you do an environmental scan across all of them, there's a lot of half of them have been achieved. 7 activities in strategic priority 2, 2 completed. So there's it hasn't really been completed. Now we know when government wants to get stuff done, they get stuff done. So this is pretty, and frustration's not the right word. Because when we are frustrated as Aboriginal people, it's misconstrued into something else. We are just underwhelmed by the performance and the delivery, and goes to that key word there of accountability that we keep hearing from government. We're accountable, but we don't see it. It's not translated, so it's not frustration, Doctor, respectfully. It's just the lack of accountability and the lack of aspiration and the lack of outcomes. Our people coming to the table, fighting really hard, volunteering their time a lot of the time, and we're looking for the outcomes. Meaningful investment in outcomes, And we're just not seeing it. It's just, oh, well, when we don't deliver it, sorry about that. But when we hear about government delivering, it's, you know, all across the media, it's in our face. But then when it comes to our people, it's just, we'll try better next time. So I'll hand back, but that's the point I'm trying to make here. It's just, sorry, we'll do better next time, hopefully. So then our people will rock up and we'll come to the forum again, and we'll, you know, whether it be Delta, we're hearing words like self-determination. I don't see self-determination represented in that. And the self-determination reform framework was, I think, agreed by government in 2016, maybe 17 at the latest. And we're talking 2019 to 2022. Respectfully, I don't see much self-determination happening. You know, we've heard of the Department of Education doing a strategy on strengthening self-determination. I made the point. You don't strengthen self-determination. Either you have self-determination or you don't. And from what we've heard from government repeatedly, we don't have self-determination. I'm yet to hear today about systems transformation. You know, we've got that's part of self-determination. What it's doing to transfer power, resources, and transferring the systems to enable self-determination. I haven't heard much about systems transformation personally today. And that's what our task is, as part of our terms of reference, is to make recommendations on the systematic injustices and make transformative recommendations for change. And it's really hard when strategies, frameworks, pilots, lack of investment in all these things are not translating into change. So it's just, yeah, pretty disappointing, but we're not frustrated.
Do you want to talk to the self-determination that was in? I completely hear what you're saying and completely hear what you're saying about measurements and outcomes. But there is an underlying principle of self-determination that is within DELTA, and it may be helpful for the Commission to hear whether it is, whether you've got feedback and want to contribute more to that framework that is within DELTA. I think it would be helpful for.
Can we precurse the that response in? Can you articulate to me what you think that our people understand self-determination? Government have a view on what self-determination is, but our people obviously have a different view, and we've heard that loud and clear. So I'd like to hear from either of yous to articulate what does self-determination look like in the context from our people's point of view. What are smiles in the back?
I'm happy to.
Please.
So,
Thanks,
Commissioner, in the context of family violence, I'd say in particular, it's about investing in those critical governance in structures, so that decision making for around authority, control, resources, it sits with DELTA as one example, but certainly other governance structures. That self-determination is in the context of policy and programmatic reform, making decisions, having the resources, being able to drive change and design in programs and policies, having the authority around building capacity across workforces, the authority to ensure that mainstream organisations are culturally safe. In the context of what the Minister was describing in terms of the self-determining structures within DELTA, and perhaps an example would be with the Aboriginal access points. So noting, of course, that the allocation comes from government. So it is an allocation of funding, and to that end, absolutely, that allocation is not self-determined. But from that point on, the decision making and around the access points, the design of them, where they would be located, what they would undertake, how they would be organised in relation to the work in those particular 3 pilot areas was all DELTA-led. All of the decision makings around that particular system transformation. And that has been the case for the sexual assault services as well. The allocations, again, come from government and are so there isn't that self-determination around the amount of resources that's provided for that innovation or for that system transformation. But from that point on, we'll support the work and support the meetings of the working groups if they're involved. Particular sub-working groups of the DELTA group are involved in the design of those programs. But thereafter, it is decision-making by Delta.
I just want to change gear a little now, if I may, and come back to that topic of misidentification before I move to reforms. We heard some evidence from Vals, particularly Mr. Jürgen Carne, about misidentification. And essentially we have police identifying the wrong person as the user of violence and noting this was a systemic problem. We've touched on this and you're aware of this issue, correct?
Yep.
He referred to the Victoria Police Code of Practice responding to an incident, which invites a gender-based and stereotypical response, calling out, when they're called out to identify what they use as the predominant aggressor. And I would like to invite your reflection on these criteria that he identified and whether the tools that are being used by Victoria Police are fit for purpose. One of the criteria used by police is how fearful the person is. He said, obviously, that's an easily manipulated thing when the person is clever, articulate, usually white, calm, and the mother is not. She's hysterical, fearful, or whatever. It's inherently gender biased. Second, another thing they look at is the historical pattern of violence. And as I said, in regional households, police will say that's a violent household. They just pick someone. And third, another thing that they look at is the nature of injuries, not once considering whether those injuries are defensive ones. So a man rings with a scratch on his face and says, look what she did, she's hysterical. So police pick him as the person in need of protection. Now, the first observation I'd make about that is that appears to directly contradict the information that Professor Fitzgibbon and her team have identified as users of violence, correct?
Yep.
And so are police using the right tools, or are these tools too prone to manipulation to be of use, or how do we address this misidentification and manipulation that's going on?
I'm not aware of those tools that he's referring to. They may or may not exist, or they may be as he has described. I can't speak to that. I can speak to the conversations that I've had with Victoria Police where they fully understand that misidentification occurs. They accept that misidentification occurs, and they are assuring me that they are putting into place cultural changes and strategies to reduce incidences of misidentification. And it is my expectation that within that understanding is intersectionality, which includes conscious or unconscious gender bias, conscious or unconscious race bias.
Would you agree that all tools are open to interpretation by whoever's using them?
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
person has a bias against First Peoples,
Yep.
particularly women, then that's going to affect the outcome of those tools.
Yeah, and it includes laziness.
The person who's complaining to me loudest is the one you listen to, for example.
Look, absolutely. And I can understand, and I'm not wanting to make excuses for anyone by any means. So I hope that this is not interpreted this way. I can understand that when you arrive at a incident and where you've got a highly charged situation, that you make an error of judgment. But it is imperative that those understandings are within that police officer, that you do know that this is a fraught environment, that you do know that your own expectation of what you might see there is not actually what may be reflected, because people respond to trauma in various ways. People using violence are often very manipulative and are very good at trying to game people and systems to get what they want. So this is why I want to go to the Academy in Glen Waverley so that I can see what they're doing and understand whether it reflects my feelings, my views, my understanding in what is being taught to Victoria Police. Because the other thing that I'm interested in is, while there is this work that appears to be going on with recruits, what is happening in terms of training for police who have been there for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? And I don't have the answer to that yet, but that's what I'm seeking.
The previous family violence risk assessment tool was called the CRAF, or Common Risk Assessment Framework, correct?
Yes.
a draft Aboriginal contextualised CRAF had been developed by the time of the Royal Commission. Is that correct?
I wasn't aware of that, Ms McLeod.
Okay. I'm referring to the Royal Commission final report here. Presumably, if there was a specific Aboriginal contextualised CRAF, this was there because there was a recognised need to contextualise family violence risk factors, specifically for First Peoples, correct?
Correct.
The MARAM does not similarly contextualise for First Peoples their experiences, does it? It's generic.
No, it does. So in the foundational knowledge document, there is certainly information and context within that foundational document, and also within the tools and the guidance documents that are used.
So can I ask you how effective those tools are as we currently use them? Does there need to be any improvement of those tools?
One, I guess, qualification I would make is that MARAM is not used by Victoria Police in that form. So they use their own tool. It's based on some aspects of MARAM, but it's not the same tool that Victoria Police use. But to your question though, the 5-year evidence-based review would say that did find that the foundational knowledge does contextualise the context for First Nations women and First Nations people who use violence, but did draw attention to where it can still be improved, particularly around use of some concepts and use of language, it was in relation to lateral violence from memory.
Commissioners, I thought we did ask for the tools used by Victoria Police, but we might ask the state to produce those tools if we don't have them. Do you know, Dr. Heenan, whether those police tools are First People specific in any way?
I don't know. I would have to be my answer. I don't know that they are.
But just on that misidentification, I know we're about to move on, but what research is being undertaken to find out how systemic it is, how
Yes.
frequent it is? Because it would seem to me to be a huge issue.
It's a huge issue.
So what work
Yeah.
is currently being done?
So Respect Victoria have got a study that is underway at the moment with the Centre for Innovative Justice at RMIT in Yoorrook, looking at exactly that.
When can we expect some results?
I think it's next year.
Yeah, I think it's located in Jura.
Yeah.
They're doing a desk-based review, so they will look at all of the evidence, but they're also looking at a very kind of practical application of making improvements quickly. So Victoria Police sits on the project control group around that. This is being led by Jura, and it was originated through Aboriginal Justice Caucus and Delta. But it's a very applied approach to the research because it's urgent.
It is, but again, I'm hearing it's Aboriginal people and organisations having to drive that change, that it's not coming from the state and it's not coming from state policies. It's always First Peoples having to actually do the legwork to get these things going.
And I turn now to, unless commissioners have any further questions around the assessment tools, can I turn now to the recent reforms that have been announced by government? The first is the appointment of the Parliamentary Secretary for Men's Behaviour. And as we understand it, the purpose of the appointment of that Parliamentary Secretary, the first position of its kind in Australia, is largely focus on the influence of the internet and social media on boys and men's attitudes towards women. And so you've obviously identified, or government has identified, that this is a primary risk area that needs to be addressed, correct?
Yes.
And what is it about the data that tells you that that is an area you have to focus on? And then I'll ask you to explain his role.
Yep. So in part, it's, for example, the research that Jesuit Social Service has done with their Manbox project, which is to look at attitudes across different different cross sections of more boys and men, different age groups of boys and men. And that research has pinpointed that while there is lots of change in boys' attitudes towards girls and women, there is a cohort that is emerging that is leaning into that unhealthy influencer behaviour in terms of gender attitudes. And this isn't something that's just happening here. We're seeing it around the world. And I don't know whether commissioners or you have seen some of the reporting on the fact that, for example, girls are becoming more and more progressive and open and inclusive in their views, but there's a cohort of boys that are going in the opposite direction.
So what is the intention of this new appointment, and how will the Parliamentary Secretary initiate useful conversations that change behaviour?
Yeah, a big part of the appointment is the amplification of the conversation. And you might have seen, even with his appointment, created quite a bit of interest and quite a bit of discussion. And again, discussion around men's behaviour change and what needs to be done. It also, you'll be unsurprised to know, attracted quite a lot of trolling, which indicated why there is a need for a lot of men's behaviour change. So it is a role for him to, in the first instance, he is going around and talking, listening, understanding what is there, what is around, because he's come into the role, is now on a bit of a learning exercise and conversation piece. And then he will start in terms of whether it's going out to schools, whether it's engaging with sports clubs, whether it is looking at men's sheds, a whole variety of different places where men gather, where you can listen to them, but also see where that conversation is shifting and what else needs to be done to shift those views and attitudes.
Commissioners have any questions about the Parliamentary Secretary appointment? The next thing I wanted to ask you about was your initiative in Ballarat, the program, a 4-year program to saturate anti-family violence awareness and focusing various sporting groups and others, targeting social media. And one of the initiatives is to test new and unidentified prevention approaches. So I invite you to talk about that initiative and what's intended and what is meant by testing new and unidentified prevention approaches.
Yep. So Respect Victoria have been leading this work where they are really wanting to understand what works and what doesn't work in terms of shifting behaviours, shifting views, shifting attitudes. So to be able to have a community that we can focus on over a 4-year period with incremental analysis done each year to understand the effect of the work that is going on is important. And it's also, to be a bit of a nerd, it's a bit exciting in the sense that we are going to have multiple programs working all at once, where you have got that everything everywhere all at once, where you've got the conversations that are already happening, whether it's through work that's going on in the sector, whether it's local government, respectful relationships, but going into those parts of the community where you don't currently reach, where it's not currently heard. How do we bring everyone into this? How do we just saturate them to a point where, you've got them, you're shifting those mindsets. So we want to understand how that works, whether it does work in terms of, and go to your point about being risk averse. We're doing something, we don't know if it will work, but we want to measure it. We want to understand it. So we will go into Ballarat. Respect Victoria will work with the services that are all there. They will work with anybody and everybody who is working within family violence, who is working within equality, but also look at where all of the opportunities are to just saturate the messaging, the understanding around the need for respect, for equality, for changing behaviours, and for the behaviours that are not that there's no tolerance for those behaviours that are not acceptable.
So what are the measures that you will use to measure whether this program is successful or not?
This will be one of the data sets that Respect Victoria will put in place. They are the research leads, so they will be working with the sector to address and understand what those data measurements will be in terms of what success looks like.
Okay, so not yet identified what those specific measurements will be?
I suspect Respect Victoria have got some clear things in mind of what they would like to measure, but they will not be confirming that until they've spoken with community.
And will the measurements involve data sharing between organisations?
It may well.
This is a significant investment in the Ballarat area. If the program seems to be successful on the measurements, would the government look to rolling it out across other areas?
I'd certainly be advocating for that.
Yep. And is it targeting Ballarat, presumably because of recent horrific cases there, but is it targeting Ballarat because there's a particular problem, or is it just a regional area that's picked?
There's a couple of reasons. Ballarat is quite a contained area in some ways. It's an area that allows you to do population measurement reasonably well, but it is also a community that we know are very open to to being a part of a solution because of the traumas that they have experienced, that they're very open to engaging and having that engagement to work, to give this program the best chance of success. They're a very well suited community.
So I'm not sure what the First Nations population is in Ballarat, but would you consider a similar program in Mildura, for example?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we just in giving Ballarat, can I just make a note here that there was a First Nations woman there who was attacked and it was just ignored.
Mm.
It was ignored by police.
Mm.
And then it took without, and it's with all due respect to say this, it takes a woman to die to actually get something done about it. That again is the silencing of our women. And I don't expect a response. I just wanted to make that comment because it's very clear in the minds of the community what happened there.
Thank you.
So do you have regional data on the prevalence of family violence across different regions, across the urban CBD, for example, that informed your decision to go to Ballarat, or was it led by this horrific case that's been reported in the news widely?
The Ballarat has, sorry, I'm going to go from memory. I can't tell you what the exact rates of family violence are. They're not one of the highest areas, but they're certainly not one of the lowest. They do have, there's multiple layers of trauma within Ballarat. And so it's a community that is one that can be worked with, where we can really be able to measure results, be able to see how effective we can be. And as I was saying, a community that is receptive to that, a community that wants to be able to see change and wants to be a part of change.
So is a necessary foundation for these sort of programs to succeed, do you think, that the community is ready to embrace these sort of programs?
It may well be, but I think that by working with a community that is ready, it allows us to really have a better understanding of what success can look like and what tweaks and what changes can be made to then go into other communities. So, for example, if we see shifts in behaviours in one part of Ballarat but not another, that can help us understand, well, what are the things that are happening in that community that isn't leading to success that then could be applied in another town or city that isn't as receptive to change.
Is there a commitment to longitudinal research to follow up on this? I mean, you might have an immediate impact on the number of reported complaints, but how do you measure the efficacy of teaching boys or girls about these critical conversations later in life?
Yeah, so there's 4 years that the program is running for, but I would hope that there is measurements that continue so that you do have really accurate longitudinal data. But longitudinal data is something that is quite missing from the sector because there hasn't been enough research done for long enough to really understand longitudinal effects within communities. And part of that challenge is also that the numbers are often not big enough to really understand and measure. There is also conflict within the sector around the fact that what do you measure when you can't measure at all? So if we're looking at, for example, the over 57,000 people using violence in the community, that's one measure. But within the sector, you can say, but it's not an accurate measure because of so much underreporting. So is it a measure or a number to be used at all? So there's some real conflict in terms of how you measure and what you measure within the sector that has inhibited, I think, in some ways, the growth in understanding and research.
Commissioners have questions about the Ballarat announcement. I just wanted to come finally to a question about law reform. And I mentioned the work of Professor Fitzgibbon and her analysis of sentencing remarks with a focus on recidivism. Nearly 20 years ago, Attorney General Robert Hulls announced the abolition of the defence of provocation as a partial defence to murder by amending the Crimes Act. In doing so, he said the law of provocation has failed to evolve sufficiently to keep pace with a changing society. By reducing murder to manslaughter, the partial defence condones male aggression towards women and is often relied upon by men who kill partners or ex-partners out of jealousy or anger. It has no place in a modern civilised society. Now, significant pushback, you may not remember, but there was significant pushback at the time in relation to the abolition of that partial defence. Similarly, concern raised within the legal profession and others about the recent introduction of amendments to the Crimes Act consent provisions, changing the burden of proof of consent in sexual assault matters. And the Minister for Victim Support, Ms. Kilkenny, noted, this is more recently, sexual violence remains a prevalent social, criminal and human rights issue. It affects community safety, particularly the safety of women and children, and causes long-term serious harm to victim survivors. Conviction rates for sexual offences remain unacceptably low. Only 1 in 23 rape cases that are reported result in a conviction. The time for change is now. And following the lead of New South Wales, those consent provisions were amended. So my question is broadly around the tensions that exist here. The rule of law is said to protect the innocent. And the fundamental underpinning of the criminal law, the thing we hear often is that supreme truth, it's better that 10 guilty men escape than 1 innocent man suffer. But if the price of that principle is the murder and serious injury of thousands of women without holding perpetrators to account, and the consequent loss of public trust in the criminal justice system, my question to you is a broad one, and I invite your reflection. Do we continue to tolerate the loss of women's lives, or do we reconsider features of the criminal justice system that inhibit this accountability? And they might be burden of proof, they might be the concept of intention or recklessness, they might be the level of satisfaction that various elements are made out, the charges to juries, considering these issues, or the persisting misuse of stereotypes about women victims and their provoking assault against them. Are these features that you think are worthwhile examining?
I think they're always worthwhile examining, and I think our laws are always worthwhile revisiting. And I think particularly in the example that you use around the provocation changes, where it's a law that has come through a patriarchal or male gaze and a male understanding of it's leaned into bias, which is the look what you made me do trope. So if we have laws that are perpetrating or are continuing a bias that exists, then we need to look at them and how that can be changed. Because that whole idea, even though the law has been gone for 20 years, we still have that use by perpetrators that often is replicated in elements of the community of that, look what you made me do. It wasn't my fault. She provoked me. She did this. She saw that. She. So that law in itself embedded a bias. That law in itself allowed perpetrators to hide. So any laws that allow us to continue that exposure, continue that gaze, continue that or strengthen that accountability, I'm very keen to learn about and to understand how that could be improved, how they could be improved.
Commissioners, those are the questions I have for the Minister and Dr. Heenan. Do the commissioners have other questions?
Got one more. What gives you inspiration and hope for the future?
Knowing that we can create change, it's really hard and it takes so long. But change does happen. We know that men can change, those violent men can change their behaviours. We know that they can make better choices. And what gives me hope is, like, for example, going back to that, when we sat down with those kids doing respectful relationships, having a 16-year-old boy explain to me what affirmative consent is and his understanding is something that gives me hope, because I would never have thought as a 16-year-old girl that there would be a boy that could do that. So knowing that there is incremental shift, even though it's so bloody slow, does give me hope, because I know it can continue and it can gain momentum.
And you're quite emotional in your response there.
Oh, because I'm so sick of it, right? We're all sick of it. We're sick of this violence.
No, it definitely wasn't a judgment. It was
No,
just
no,
more to
no,
say,
I've-
it's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, it is really important to me.
I've just got one final comment with relation to the monitoring, evaluation and accountability plan. Can you report back to us when you do get measures that are actually measurable?
Yes, absolutely, Commissioner Walter. We'll do that.
And before we close, so right now we know that First Nations women are overrepresented as victim survivors of family violence. And in Australia, First Nations women are 33 times more likely to be hospitalised for family violence injuries than non-First Nations women. And First Nations women are 6 times more likely to pass away from family violence than non-First Nations women. This is the stark reality. These statistics are not mere numbers. They represent lives shattered, families torn apart and futures stolen. We know that the rate of family violence is rising across Victoria, but that it is increasing at a faster rate for our people. So, Minister, as a reminder, we have a call-on for you. It's a reminder to the office that you hold. It's a reminder that the overrepresentation of Aboriginal women and children within the family violence system and the unfinished work we have to ensure our women and children are safe. The Coolmine has the artwork on it, the back of an Aboriginal woman wearing a possum skin cloak. This is a reminder of the silencing of our women, and also Bunjil watching over the Coolmine. As Coolmine holds the souls of our women and children that have died at the hands of unjustified violence. And we want this displayed somewhere as a reminder that we must do better.
Thank you. I promise you it will be.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you. We are now ready to adjourn council and until tomorrow morning at 9:30, I believe. But can I thank you so much for the heavy hearing that we've just had, the heavy evidence of slow progress, which seems to be our lot. But thank you for being here and just thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Council.
for the opportunity.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Hunter, would you like to present the one?
A long walk.
Thank you, Commissioners.